Hello, welcome to our webinar on bureaucratic resistance and global autocratic ambition. I'm Sue Stokes. I am from the Chicago Center on Democracy, and the other organization that is sponsoring this event is the Chicago Center on Effective Government. We are thrilled to have an amazing set of presenters with us today. We are going to be starting with a panel initially focusing on Eastern Europe, and then we will be talking about Latin America. And then the third panel we'll be having is going to be kind of bringing together a kind of more of a global vision and comparative vision about these really interesting questions of how bureaucracies are under attack from aspiring autocrats, and what, if anything, they're able to do to resist those attacks. This is a topic related to the question of would-be autocracy, of democratic erosion, has received an enormous amount of attention from political scientists and other social scientists, and rightly so. But the question of their attacks on the bureaucracy specifically is just now, I think, coming into focus. And so we're really excited to have such a stellar group of presenters on this topic. So we're going to start with the focus on the, let me just mention that this is a follow-up, in a sense, of a webinar that we held in May that was focused on the US, on the sort of the Trump administration's attacks on the so-called deep state. So this is exciting to have, to move that set of questions into a more international arena. And we will have Americanists involved, especially in our third panel, to kind of draw reflections from what we've learned about other regions of the world to the US experience as well. So let me see. Okay. So let me start by introducing our panelists for our first session. And they are, just very briefly, Monika Nalepa, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago. Her research focuses on post-communist Europe. Her interests include transitional justice, parties and legislatures, and game theoretic approaches to comparative politics. We also are delighted to have with us Barbara Maria Piotrowska, and I apologize for all mispronunciations in advance. She is the Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at the Department of Political Economy in King's College London. Her research focuses on bureaucracies as a direct point of intersection between state and society. And she concentrates in particular on the incentives faced by bureaucrats, as well as how their organization and operations advance bureaucratic goals. We also have with us Dan Kelemen, who is Professor of Political Science and Law and Jean Monnet Chair in European Union Politics at Rutgers University. And his research focuses on the politics of the European Union, law and politics, comparative political economy, and comparative public policy. And we also have with us Tim Frye, who is the Marshall D. Schulman Professor of Post-Soviet Foreign Policy at Columbia University. His research interests are in comparative politics and political economy, with a focus on the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. My name is Sue Stokes. I am by training a Latin American regional expert, and I'm interested in democracy, democratization, democratic erosion, and other topics in comparative politics. So we are actually going to go not in the order that I just introduced folks. We're going to go in alphabetical order, very creative on my part. So I'm going to ask Tim Frye to get us started. And Tim is going to talk to us about pressure that state bureaucracies put on, pressures that politicians put on state bureaucracies in voter mobilization efforts. And he's a Russia expert of, kind of stellar kind of level, but he's also going to make some comparative remarks with regard to the US, Argentina, Turkey, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. So Tim, get us started. Oh, by the way, audience members, Questions that you have, we will be doing question and answer. Please put your questions, write your questions into the Q&A function on Zoom. And we will get to those questions. If we're not able, if we have a kind of overflow of questions, we will get to them by the third session today. So, so please do start asking questions. Tim, go ahead.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here to kick off this session, which couldn't be more timely. And it's just a great group of presenters. So already well done in terms of organization. I'm going to talk about a particularly egregious form of eroding democracy by undermining bureaucracy. That is, efforts by politicians to put pressure on state employees around election time. And these can range from subtle and not so subtle hints about how to vote, whom to vote for, to more forceful measures, such as compelling bureaucrats to take part in political rallies, compelling them to try to mobilize other voters, or to make threats of dismissal, threats of cuts in wages, threats of cutting off access to promotions. And this really violates some of the core principles of democracy. The notion that political actors can make choices of their own volition without repercussions is really at the core of democratic theory. So I think this activity directly undermines democracy. But I also think it indirectly undermines democracy as well by eroding the integrity of these bureaucracies that are supposed to provide a public good. So if the public comes to see these agencies mostly as political wings of one or another party or movement or individual, then we should expect to see trust in these kinds of institutions that are so central to democracy as well. So I think that there's a direct threat to democracy in these kinds of efforts by politicians to threaten state bureaucrats to engage in political activity, but it's also an indirect one as well. It's a problem that's difficult to study. We, with John Reuter at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and David Zacconi at George Washington University, have been studying various forms of workplace mobilization of voters over the last decade. And we've done surveys in Argentina, Indonesia, Nigeria, Russia, Turkey, Ukraine, and Venezuela to get some sense of the prevalence of this activity. And it is fairly widespread. If we take a kind of broad understanding of political mobilization within state bureaucracies, we find that in Argentina, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Russia, about 40% of the bureaucrats who fell into our national random sample reported experiencing some form of political mobilization in the workplace. In Venezuela, the number was 60%. That was on the high end. On the lower end were Turkey and the US, where around 20% of bureaucrats reported experiencing at least some form of political mobilization. And in more rigorous assessments, we looked at the factors that predict what makes it more likely for a state bureaucrat to be exposed to some form of political mobilization. We found that controlling for just a range of demographic features, regional characteristics, in 7 of the 8 states that we looked at, state workers were on average, about 15 percentage points more likely to be mobilized by their bosses than were their counterparts in the private sector. So this is a pretty common problem. And this occurred in 7 of the 8 countries in our sample. We found significant differences between the rates at which state bureaucrats were mobilized relative to private sector workers. And of course, any kind of, we say that the difference between these two groups is significant, but any level of political mobilization in state bureaucracies should make us unnervous. So what about some of the cases where we didn't find this effect? Well, one interesting case was Turkey, where we found that there was actually a negative relationship, that if you worked in the private sector, you were more likely to be mobilized by your boss than if you worked in the state sector. But we don't think that's a great case to draw lessons from. We think it's more of an accounting issue, in that there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that rather than employing state contractors directly, they kind of put pressure on state subcontractors, so people who are contracting with the state rather than state employees with directly. I mean, the US case is another one where the rate of political mobilization or exposure to politics in the workplace is lower than in the private sector by a considerable margin. And this, goes back to the Hatch Act of 1939, which was a kind of bipartisan effort to put pressure on Harry Hopkins and the Works Progress Administration, who the conservative wings in the Democratic Party and the Republicans thought that he was getting too much power. And there's been this longstanding bipartisan support for political restrictions in state bureaucracy, in federal bureaucracies in the United States. And in the Trump era, we saw an increase in kind of rates of violations of the Hatch Act, but in comparative perspective, the U.S. case still looks pretty good. The Russia case, where we've done an awful lot of our work, suggests another way that state bureaucracies can be insulated somewhat from this political pressure. And what we found is that in regions within Russia where media freedom was higher, controlling for a whole host of other factors, state bureaucrats were less likely to be mobilized than in regions where the media was less free. So I think that was kind of an interesting finding, and it suggests that their attacks on state bureaucracies and on state media might be complements rather than substitutes, in that in weakening the private media, it also makes it easier for politicians to put pressure on state bureaucrats and undermine democracy in that way. So I'll just leave it there to say that this is a widespread problem, one that we need to think a lot harder about. It seems to be widespread across a range of types of political systems. And one solution is a kind of political solution through civil service guarantees. And another way to kind of reduce this problem is by looking at the institutions that surround bureaucracies and give them the kind of political independence on which democracy depends. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Tim. And I can see that not only are you a political scientist, but you're a good citizen. You got your I voted.
Oh yes, it was election day here in New York City. So yes, we've been out and voted already.
We practice what we preach. Great. So next up is Dan Kelemen, who's going to talk to us about Hungary and Poland. Go ahead, Dan.
All right, thanks very much for having me. And I'll focus really mostly on Hungary just because the time is short, but I'm happy to answer questions about the Polish case as well in the Q&A. And first, I'd just like to, in addition to thanking you for having me, I want to congratulate the organizers on identifying what I think is really a very important topic in the sort of realm of backsliding, because while there has, as you said in your introduction, there's been, of course, great attention to many aspects of backsliding phenomena, and in particular on range of institutions, from attacks on independent judiciaries, manipulation of elections and parties. There really has been, I think, as you said, very little work on the role of administrations and on the attacks on bureaucracies. So I think this is important. I would want to note that there's one book, I don't know if the organizers have come across this. I think I've seen the proofs, but I don't think it's quite out yet, but a new book on democratic backsliding and public administration by Bauer, Peters, and 3 other co-authors coming out that I think does a nice job with some of these issues. But anyway, with all that said, what can I say about Hungary? And I think focus on Hungary is useful because it's the most dramatic case of backsliding in the European Union, first of all, followed closely by Poland. But also, globally, it's one of the fastest backsliders in the past decade. If you look at VDEM's figures, from 2010 to 2020, the most rapid backsliders around the world, Hungary and Poland's actually the fastest. Hungary is right there and it's one of the few cases we have, where a country is descended from the category of kind of liberal democracies all the way to electoral autocracy or competitive authoritarianism. Okay. So in that respect, it's a useful case, I think, to look at for those who are worried about other liberal democracies and whether they might fall so far as to descend into the kind of category of hybrid authoritarian regimes. So those are reasons that it's useful to study Hungary. What are the main lessons we can take? Well, it's pretty sobering in terms of the theme before us today. I guess my main takeaway would be, do not count on the bureaucracy or the public administration to stand up to the autocrats. Don't count on them. Certainly the Hungarian case would suggest, A, they didn't make much of an effort, if any, and B, whatever effort they made was a complete failure. They have had, I would say, no discernible discouraging effect on the backsliding trends we've seen there. And so that's the main takeaway. Now, basically, the long story short, which I can't go into in just a few minutes, is, as most of you will be very familiar, after Orbán's Fidesz party won a major victory in 2010 in what was at the time a free and fair election, given the disproportionate nature of the Hungarian system, with a plurality of the votes, they were able to translate that in actually a 2/3 majority in parliament, which in the Hungarian system allowed them to rewrite, amend or replace the constitution. And basically what we saw then in the years following 2010 was what some have called a constitutional revolution, where they completely remade the institutional order of the country in a way designed to concentrate power in the hands of the ruling party, including throughout the bureaucracy, which I'll get to in a second, where that took the form of taking even previously independent offices and putting them under political control, putting in place appointees closely tied to the ruling party in newly created positions with long tenures of office, et cetera, and gradually, famously seizing control of the judiciary. But to our point, specifically today on the administration, it's quite striking. This was one of their very first targets. Right away in 2010, they passed a major law which essentially did away with the career civil service and the kind of protections for career civil servants. And in the initial version of this law in 2010 allowed dismissal of public administrators without any justification whatsoever. Now, the Constitutional Court hadn't quite been captured yet at that time. They were still in process. And so the Constitutional Court pushed back on that a bit and overruled that provision of the law. But then, as has been the dynamic with this regime, when they came back with a new version of the law on civil servants, now they say you have to provide a justification. You can't fire people without a justification. But here are two of the justifications that superiors can use to fire civil servants: lack of loyalty, right? Or non-conformance with the supervisor's value standards. Okay, so basically what they did then is they purged all the upper echelons of the bureaucracy with haste, and quickly put in place their own cronies throughout the bureaucracy, diminishing its expertise, making these patronage jobs for Fidesz loyalists. This went through all the top levels of the hierarchy. They also put through reforms to greatly centralize control in the close circle around the prime minister. And they did this not just in the staffing, where they did the purge and replace, but also in things like budgeting, including both the expenditures, but also the distribution of funds from the EU was very centralized. And so that the bureaucracy essentially, instead of being any kind of impediment to the regime, it quickly became a very effective servant of the regime's backsliding agenda. I could go on and on, but I guess the last thing I'd say, are there any publicly minded democratic, let's say civil servants with democratic values? Sure there are, but they're operating in a real environment of fear, right? Those who are left. There's fear of being laid off if you're seen as at odds with your superiors who are all party loyalists. And so, that environment of fear, I think, it makes people keep their heads down and keep quiet. And the very last thing I'd just like to say, when we talk about civil servants or the administration, I guess one question I'd be curious what others think, how far down does this go? And I would emphasize that in Hungary, the party takeover of the administration, we're not just talking about like senior civil servants. We're down to the level of school headmasters and even teachers. Basically, they all have to pass kind of Fidesz loyalty tests in a sense. Every principal of every school in Hungary is Fidesz connected, right? And teachers dare not, this is like communist times, they dare not like say critical things about the ruling party in social studies classes, right? For fear that some student tells their parent who tells the headmaster and gets them fired. So it's pretty much pervasively a party state by now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. That was a thoroughly depressing presentation and very enlightening at the same time. He mentioned a book. I think a number of us, I got it, sent this wonderful book, Bauer et al. Edited volume that's coming out with Cambridge University Press. I actually don't have the details in front of me, but it descended like manna from heaven just a week before this session. So I'm sure many of us have been greedily kind of reading that. So next we will have Monika Nalepa. So take it away, Monika.
Thanks. I'm actually having trouble sharing my screen. Hold on, let me try this again. Oh, maybe now it will work. Yeah, no, that worked. Excellent. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I'm really glad that Dan ended with this reference to communism, because when I started thinking about the potential for bureaucracies to resist creeping authoritarianism, I thought, well, that kind of like depends what kind of bureaucracies they are. And I think in the context of post-communist Europe, it's very hard to abstract from the fact that Poland, Hungary, and these countries in this region are basically squeezed between one definite authoritarian experience and another potential authoritarian experience. So I'm going to approach this question from the point of view of what kind of bureaucracies do these countries actually have? And fortunately, working in the global, in the Transitional Justice and Democratic Stability Lab here at the University of Chicago has allowed me to gain this perspective from the point of view of data collection on how Poland, Hungary, and a number of other countries in the region, as well as across the globe, dealt with the personnel that they inherited from their former authoritarian regimes. So the dilemma that is faced after authoritarianism is how to deal with former authoritarian elites, but also the agents of those elites. And those can be agents of repression, and they can also be bureaucrats. So there are two arguments here that are very much competing. One is to just punish those agents very harshly and completely fire them and start building agencies anew. Maybe so harshly because of the fear that repression, that without it, repression has the potential of returning. But on the other hand, there is this fear that punishing outgoing autocrats and their collaborators and the bureaucrats might incite authoritarian backlash. So that is why punitive forms of transitional justice, especially in the post-communist region, have sort of given way to non-punitive forms of transitional justice, namely personnel transitional justice. So this is where the bureaucrats become relevant. So there are two ways really of dealing with sort of like two types of personnel transitional justice policies, right? On the one hand, there's dealing with secret collaborators. And this is your opening of the archives of the secret police and finding out who the informers of the secret police were. And oops, sorry about that. And finding out who the informers of the secret police were. But that doesn't really tap into those who worked for the former regime in the form of, on the one hand, bureaucrats, so the state administration, and on the other hand, law enforcement. So thus far, I very much thought about purges, so the removal of known collaborators along the lines of removing from their positions members of the police, especially agents of the secret police, and basically people who were sort of like experts in violence on part of the communist regime. But the invitation to present this panel sort of urged me to actually like rethink the role of purges when it concerns bureaucrats, right? So not those who are necessarily specialists in violence, but were specialists in sort of in upkeeping the communist state. What the transitional justice database has allowed us to do is basically collect data in chronological order on how countries recovering from authoritarianism, including post-communist states such as Poland, such as Hungary, over the years since they transitioned to democracy, have dealt with their former authoritarian elites, state apparatus, agents of law enforcement, and so on. And what we've done in the lab is we've separated transitional justice events into positive events, so decisions at the state level that have moved the transitional justice process forward, and negative events, that is the decisions that have halted the process or created impediments to it. And this has allowed us to basically come up with measures of the harshness, or if you will, severity of transitional justice. So what I'm going to now show you is data from Europe on the severity of transitional justice over time, over the years since the transition to democracy. And I'm going to ask you to focus here on several European countries. And what I'm going to do is show you a contrast between purges of bureaucracy and purges of law enforcement. So this is the newest from the Transitional Justice and Democratic Stability Lab. We've actually disaggregated these purges. And this pretty interesting picture emerges. So these are selective purges, which means it's sort of like not a wholesale closing of state agencies that took place in the years following communism, but instead it's actually sort of like verifying on a case-by-case basis who is able to keep their job in the state administration versus not, or law enforcement. So it seems that in Europe, basically, purges of the bureaucracy have gone hand in hand with purges of law enforcement. With some exceptions though, right? So on the one hand, so these are selective purges. So in Poland, selective purges have gone hand in hand of bureaucracy and law enforcement. But then in Hungary, there haven't been many selective purges in either, actually. So if you, so these are the selective purges. Now on the next slide, there are thorough purges. So these are purges where a whole agency is closed down and sort of everybody is fired. And this is a pretty interesting picture because Poland now only had those wholesale closings of enforcement agencies, but most of the bureaucratic agencies were actually left intact from the communist period. And in contrast, Hungary over here had pretty high levels of both wholesale closing of enforcement agencies and bureaucratic agencies. So the two countries actually are not very similar to one another when it comes to who those bureaucrats residing in those state agencies were. On the one hand, in Poland, the bureaucrats were sort of selectively purged, but their agencies had never gotten completely closed down. Whereas the Hungarian bureaucrats, who seem to be, as Dan suggested, not resisting Fidesz's takeover, are basically newly formed communities of bureaucrats, if you will, that had to sort of like build anew since communism. So I think those legacies are important to keep in mind when we are thinking about bureaucratic resistance in the region. I also have two other slides showing the same data for Latin America, which I will just gloss over to give you an idea of how little time or how much time in post-communist Europe was spent on purges relative to other regions. So this is the comparison picture for selective purges in Latin America, only purges of law enforcement, which kind of makes sense since those were military regimes. And these are the thorough purges in Latin America. Basically, only three countries undertook thorough purges of the military apparatus. So this is basically just a perspective of, well, okay, if the bureaucrats are resisting, who are actually the bureaucrats? And I think this helps us understand who actually was staffing those agencies at the time when Orban, Kaczynski, and others came to power. So I'll end there. Thank you. And I'll stop sharing my screen also.
Thank you, Monika. That's fascinating. And I should have mentioned at the beginning, when we get into the Q&A, it'll be great to have panelists talking to each other, I'd be really interested to see how Dan reacts to Dan and Tim react to that. Okay, as a late alphabet person, I can say that I spend all my life coming last, but Barbara, definitely last but not least. Please go ahead.
Hi, hello, thank you, Sue, for inviting me to this fascinating panel. And the advantage of going last is that I also can kind of react to the previous panelists' kind of contributions. But let me start by just saying that in general, in my contribution, I would like to highlight the role of two factors. So the role of street level bureaucrats and the motivating role of ideology, because I feel like these two aspects are frequently overlooked in the discussion of the interplay between bureaucracy and democratic backsliding, but can be important in the Eastern European context and beyond. Now, starting with street level bureaucracy, and here maybe responding a bit to Dan, I guess my general outlook is going to be a little bit more positive, but I would be very interested to get into more discussion later on. So maybe, okay, let's step back. So by street level bureaucrats, following Lipsky, I mean public sector workers working directly with citizens and delivering policy. So here you should think about occupations such as teachers, judges, police force, and so on. So they're important in the context of democratic backsliding, as they are the ones who actually implement policy, and they also shape the way in which ordinary citizens experience policy. Hence, they have the potential to slow down the process and affect citizen satisfaction with the government. And now this can happen in two ways. So firstly, this more active way, if you want to think about it more like sabotage, they can actively use their street level bureaucrat discretion to steer policy. And here we can think about, for example, judges ruling against the wishes of the government. The second mechanism is perhaps a little bit less obvious and a little bit closer to maybe shirking, is that the street level bureaucrats can consciously or unconsciously display lower levels of effort put into policy implementation kind of across the board. Now, the second and related aspect I wanted to highlight today is the role played by ideology in motivating street level bureaucrats. And here I kind of want to go back to my work on East German Stasi, because there I've seen that appeals to political ideology and ideological conviction were the most prominent ways in which the Stasi tried to recruit their informants. And then depending on the extent to which you actually trust the Stasi files, this appeals to political conviction was also the main way in which informants were enrolled. But the role of ideology is kind of visible in wider context. So in a recent working paper, I show that political alignment with government increases street level bureaucrats' motivation. And that is, if you think about government worker who voted for government in power, they would declare higher job satisfaction, pride of work, and willingness to work harder, as opposed to those that voted for parties that did not end up being in government. Hence here, I can see in that paper a kind of crucial importance of political ideology in motivating people in more like kind of unconscious, possibly unconscious ways. Now, putting these two observations together, I think that in the discussion of the role of bureaucracy in frustrating democratic backsliding, it's important to consider the contribution of street level bureaucrats, as well as their levels of support for parties in power. Because if they support the government in power, they might contribute to democratic backsliding. But if they do not, they might, through their kind of everyday small actions, undermine it. And we have seen anecdotal evidence for this anti-democratic backsliding or anti-populist sentiment in Poland. And so, for example, in 2016, we have seen a march of Teachers for Democracy. Then last year, after the Constitutional Tribunal ruling concerning abortion, we have also seen kind of police joining protesters. Then more prominently, Polish Judges Association Justitia, whose activities are concerned with defending the rule of law, currently has more than 3,500 members, or around 30% of all judges. Naturally, not all these members are actively sabotaging the government. This is a small minority, but I do believe that membership that such membership is a credible signal of disagreement with governmental activities limiting the rule of law. Now, all of the above are of course only anecdotes, and we do need more systematic research to establish the extent to which this anti-democratic backsliding sentiment is prevalent among different street-level bureaucrat occupations, because it can also be different between teachers, policemen, and judges. But what I will argue is that the action of street-level bureaucrats has the potential to, if not completely stop, then slow down or alter the implementation of certain democratic backsliding policies. And they certainly affect the exact way in which individual citizens experience policies that underlie democratic backsliding. So this is kind of what I wanted to say for now, and I'm looking forward to our discussion in a second. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah, Tim, go for it. Let me just say quickly, if you're in the audience and you have a question, please do write your question in the Q&A function, and we will get to them. So yeah, but let's go first to Tim, and then I see Dan and Monika also have their hands up.
Just a quick comment about the importance of unpacking the state and how useful that can be or not for understanding the problem that we're all discussing today. How should we think about what parts of the state are more or less vulnerable to this? I mean, in Dan's case, it seems like, that that there's just this momentum that takes place. Once one part of the state falls, it's harder for the other parts of the state to resist. But then, we think like in Virginia Oliveros's work on Argentina, we see that there's a big difference between the political activities of bureaucrats that are appointed by civil service and political appointees. And even in the Russian case, and the Russian central bank is, it makes compromises like all central banks do, but I think it's pretty well thought of as an agency that upholds its mandate. So, should we think about the state as, kind of pockets of resistance, as kind of Barbara mentioned, or is it just the case that once this process gets rolling, it becomes harder and harder to stop? I think that has implications for how we study the problem, but also as we think about strategies to try to protect bureaucrats. I think that's also one consideration we might want to talk about.
Great, thank you, Tim. We have a couple questions coming in, but let's go to our panelists first. Monika, go ahead.
I thought Dan was ahead of me.
But... Oh, sorry. Dan, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Well, yeah, either way, but I'll be very quick. On point Barbara brought up about street level bureaucrats, and it kind of relates to Tim's point about the different elements of the sections of the state. I would just add something we haven't really talked about. I guess when we talk about the administration, the implication is we're talking about the national administration. But I do think there's also important issues surrounding the role of local governments, okay? Even if that's not exactly what you meant, Barbara, when you say, because there can be street level national bureaucrats, but there's also the local governments. And I think, in the case of Hungary, on the one hand, the national government really penetrated, or the politicization of the bureaucracy went all the way to the street level, in the sense that kind of county offices run by the central government were highly politicized. But on the other hand, where you had like local mayors, for instance, the guy who's going to be challenging Orban in the upcoming election is an opposition mayor, or in Budapest, where you have the opposition elected in a number of cities, et cetera. There you did have those local governments controlled by opposition trying to use the tools and resources of local government, including their local administrations, to resist autocratization, right? And anyway, there's a lot more to be said about that, and battles between the central government and the local governments. But that's, I think, another element. And should I, Susan, answer the question that was put to me in the Q&A while I'm at it, or no? Sorry, you're muted.
Actually, yeah, sorry. Let's quickly go to Monika, and then we'll jump to the Q&A. I just wanted to jump in and say that one of the issues that Barbara's presentation raised in my mind is the sort of variation in the nature or motivation behind potential bureaucratic resistance. So there's one kind of resistance that's like, we're in danger of losing our jobs, our salaries are being cut. There's sort of, kind of resistance by bureaucrats, qua bureaucrats. And then there's also potential political resistance that can be partisan, can be ideological, can be resistance to the kind of project of erosion. And it's interesting to think about success or failure of those kinds of motivations. By the way, stick around, folks, please, for the next Latin America session, because I think you're going to see some interesting variation there. Monika, your turn.
Yeah, so super quickly, just to comment on Justicia, this association of judges in Poland, I think that's an excellent illustration of the point that Sue made, that it can be ideological motivation or just like fear of losing jobs, because there are judges who are basically being forced into retirement or forced to move to the outskirts, to some rural areas in Poland as part of retaliation for ruling in the in PiS's disfavor. But another thing to keep in mind is, like, here I think this legacy aspect is particularly well visible, because the judiciary is probably the sole sector of the state that completely avoided purges and lustration, because every time that there was a decommunization bill put together in Poland, the judiciary would make sure that it exempts itself by using the argument of rule of law and judiciary independence. So they kind of have experience in resisting purges, which I think is coming in now handy. I mean, it seems like the state is like really cracking down and trying to purge all the judges, but I think if it wasn't for that strong network and sense of community, and like, we survived purges of the anti-communists, will survive purges of peace. I think the judiciary would have been weakened much faster in Poland.
So I want us to start getting to some of the questions that are coming in from our audience. Dan, there's one there that's for you. Do you want to take that one on? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I can just be very quick. That there was a question about Orban's promotion support of Janša in Slovenia, who's Orban's mini-me in a way, and an aspiring autocrat, if not a fully successful one yet. And I guess the answer, to your question, yes, there is networking between these aspiring autocrats. There's learning of lessons. Certainly, Orban is promoting an agenda of spreading autocratization in countries in the region, not only in Slovenia. He's also doing it, through the accession process, where Orban managed. He kind of basically convinced von der Leyen as a political payoff to put one of his lackeys in charge of enlargement. So the EU Commissioner for Enlargement is a loyal servant of Fidesz, who then promotes their anti-democratic agenda, vis-a-vis Serbia and others kind of in the enlargement context. So that's, I think, definitely something to watch out for. But the other part of the question is kind of, is there a far-right international? And I would just say, I think the one limiting factor is these far-right people have hard time sustaining cooperation, and the list of names the questioner gave, and building a true pan-European far-right movement, thankfully.
Thanks. That's really interesting. I remember being so struck by Viktor Orban's invitation to the White House. I think he came twice during the Trump administration, and sort of, the puzzle who's the constituency in the United States for that visit? It seemed like that wasn't what it was about at all. So Tim, I'm going to turn you into our Turkey expert, since you talked about Turkey, and there's a question about Turkey in the Q&A. Would you mind I don't know if you've had a chance to take a look at it.
Yeah, I took a quick look at it, and I'm not an expert on Turkey by any stretch, but the issue raised here is the opposition declared October 18th a day by which, after that date, the opposition, should they come to power, would hold bureaucrats responsible for following orders that they saw as illegal. And it raises this really interesting question about what's the relationship between opposition parties or movements and bureaucratic resistance. And one of the reasons we're concerned about political abuse of the bureaucracies is that it really makes the playing field very uneven, because the opposition is not in a position immediately to provide the kinds of carrots and sticks that incumbents do. So there's just a big incumbency advantage, and from a perspective of democratic theory, it's problematic. On the one hand, this kind of, if the opposition kind of recruits bureaucrats to their side to be anti-government, in the short run, that would seem to be a way to buck up political resistance. But then it also just raises the question that it increases the politicization of the bureaucracy, as a norm in and of itself. So I think there's an interesting strategy question about, should the opposition try to promote bureaucratic neutrality as a norm, or are there real benefits to trying to politicize the bureaucracy in order to weaken the incumbents, given the huge advantages that incumbents have? So I think that's almost a transitional justice kind of questions of what do bureaucrats do when a new party comes to power, and should we hold them accountable or not? So I'll leave it there.
When Tim, when you started your presentation, I, as a Latin Americanist, thought that what you meant was bureaucrats being mobilized to mobilize other people.
Yes.
But I think what you're talking about is they're just being the sort of end of the line mobilization. So you can see that I'm a Latin Americanist from.
Yeah, no, both of those things go on, and it's the range of types of activities that they engage in. Some of them are really normatively unappealing, and some of them could be justified in terms of increasing turnout and increasing information about policy. So it's a much more subtle topic than I'm able to convey in the short topic, but it's worth paying attention to.
Emily Tallow has a very interesting question, which I'm just going to throw out to anybody who would like to engage with it. She says, I'm wondering about the role of political patronage in all of this. Much of the evidence presented in the webinar suggests that backsliding leaders make use of coercion to get rid of civil servants or make them bend to their will. But is there a possibility of political patronage being used as carrots to compel civil servants to go along with executive-led backsliding? Anybody want to take that one? Monika, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So I think that's a great question. And I think, again, it sort of like depends on what the career expectations of bureaucrats were at the time. So if bureaucracies were professionalized, if the civil service was professionalized so that bureaucrats had a sort of like clear path of, like what they need to do in order to advance in the ranks, then I think I think sort of offering them patronage as a shortcut would be unattractive for the competent bureaucrats, but very attractive for the incompetent ones, right? So like, here comes somebody who will reward loyalty and not care for the fact that you're incompetent as long as you go ideologically with them. So it could happen, but would the autocrat do it? I don't think so, because it would be basically shooting himself in the foot by surrounding themselves with incompetent bureaucrats down the road. So a lot of what I'm saying here is based on this classical loyalty competency trade-off. There's a pretty large literature in the study of authoritarian regimes on this phenomenon. So I think that would backfire down the line, but it doesn't mean that would be autocrats won't do that or aren't doing it.
I'm going to give the word to Barbara, but just before, Michael Bauer is in the audience, one of the editors of the volume that I mentioned, that was mentioned earlier. Michael, if you want to just put the specific information about it in the Q&A, I'd be happy to advertise it for you. It's really terrific. Barbara, go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to add one point about political patronage, and it's a little bit more kind of nuanced than the direct just giving goodies for loyalty. It's more kind of building on Bryn Rosenfeld's work about basically increasing the size of public sector to increase the number of people that basically owe their work to the government. And this is what Bryn argues. This is what's been going on in Hungary. So I think it's one thing to think about people who are already in place being bought off or replaced by somebody loyal, but the other thing is this kind of extensive margin. It's basically just increasing the number of people that can be dependent for their job by the government.
Thank you. We just have a couple minutes left. We're actually going to take a quick break between panels. And I don't see any more questions in the Q&A. I was going to ask Dan if you would respond to, it seemed as though the image I had from your presentation was the kind of bureaucracy being cut through like, you know, a knife through soft butter. And Barbara had a little bit more sort of view of effective resistance. Do you want to kind of jump in on that? Are you guys looking at different things? Do you think, tell us your reaction.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd want to talk to Barbara more, and you know, which kind of examples and things she has in mind. I mean, I would say that, you know, one thing that's come up, I mean, I wouldn't call it the bureaucracy exactly, it's the judiciary, but you know, the example of the Polish judges and justice. When I think of in Poland and Hungary, where has the greatest, you know, the greatest resistance from, let's say, officials working in some capacity in government come, it's been those Polish judges, been the most mobilized, you know, fighting for rule of law against the moves of the regime. I think, you know, in Hungary, I just haven't seen it really myself. And I think, but it's not that I'm blaming, you know, civil servants for not doing more. I think in these kind of hybrid authoritarian, you know, electoral authoritarian regimes, it's tough to do because after all, like when Fidesz came in, they had an electoral mandate, right? And moreover, since they had a constitutional majority at 2/3, you know, what they did was kind of legal. This is like what Javier Corrales, or, you know, using his term, Kim Lane Sheblev talk about as, you know, autocratic kind of legalism. And that makes it much harder. You know, it's already hard for civil servants to kind of resist when it looks political to do so, but it's even harder when the autocrats are using legalistic techniques, you know, and it's not like they're acting with blatant illegality. So, but yeah, I don't observe in the Hungarian case much resistance from the administration.
Okay. Very quickly, Michael Bauer, the book is going to be, the details are going to be posted in the chat. It's called Democratic Backsliding in Public Administration, How Populists in Government Transform State Bureaucracies. We're going to break in a couple of minutes, but there's one question that maybe we can get to before we break. Marjorie Morona asked about the background of the sort of elite profile and origins, as she puts it, of bureaucrats. She mentions judicial folks, but I think in general that might be a quite an interesting question. If we, you know, sort of for the sake of argument, say that there's some variation in the success of bureaucrats to resist democratic erosion, does there, Monika very interestingly has suggested potential connections between sort of the legacy of the sort of post-authoritarian periods, but are there differences in origins, in recruitment, in Barbara's also suggested sort of partisan allegiances, in explaining that variation? Somebody just jump in with a quick question. We have approximately, sorry, quick answer. We have 1 minute for a quick answer to that. We can come back to these issues later on in the day. Any takers? Tim, go ahead.
So I was just going to throw out one other factor that we haven't talked much about, is just kind of international, what role can international actors play in this? You know, we've talked really primarily from a domestic point of view. And I mention this because I am I guess I'm a street level bureaucrat of the Russian government, having a position at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. And I think one of the things that, you know, helps in some ways is the international profile of the university, which, you know, I think is helped insulate it in some ways, even if you know, the overall picture, you know, looks looks very difficult. So that was just, you know, when you mentioned, you know, kind of the role of you know, elite origins and career trajectories is one possible factor. You know, one thing that we might want to talk about more is what role can the international community play. And it can cut both ways, where it can also spark a backlash, if it's done in the wrong way. So I throw that out as a topic for the next couple of panels.
Well, fantastic. Thank you so much to our panelists and to our audience. We are taking a very quick break before we start in on Latin America panel, which is going to be equally exciting. So please come back, and many thanks to all of you. Greetings, everyone. We are beginning the second panel of our conference bureaucratic resistance to global autocratic ambitions. We just had a wonderful panel on Europe, and we are now shifting geographically to Latin America. We have 4 panelists who are highly distinguished and extremely appropriate in terms of their research interest to our sessions today. Let me just very briefly introduce them, and then panelists, we're gonna, I'm very creatively going in alphabetical order for presentation. So, but let me just introduce them. Gabriela Lotta is a professor and researcher of public administration and government at the Getulio Vargas Foundation. She is the coordinator of the Bureaucracy Studies Group at the foundation, and her work focuses on the areas of public policy, bureaucracy, implementation, and government management. So welcome, Gabriela. Eduardo D'Argent is associate professor of political science at the Catholic University of Peru. His research focuses on comparative politics in Latin America, especially on political regimes and political parties. Warm welcome to Eduardo. Javier Corrales is the Dwight W. Morrow 1895 professor of political science at Amherst College. His research on Latin America has focused on the quality of democracy, regime type, presidential powers, political parties, education reform, economic policy making, energy security, and international relations. More recently, Corrales has branched off into the subject of LGBT rights and how they are spreading unevenly throughout Latin America. And as a longtime consumer of Javier's work, I can say that that's as long as that list was, it doesn't even cover all of the things that he's written really interesting work on. Julio Rios Figueroa is associate professor of law at the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México, or ITAM, his research focuses on comparative politics, the rule of law, and empirical legal studies with an empirical focus on the Latin American region. And I can just say that recently, Julio has been the source of amazing information to yours truly about the recent evolution in kind of judicial politics and encroachments on the judiciary by the Mexican government. So thank you so much, Julio. So as mentioned, we are going to go in alphabetical order. Let me just repeat to our audience that you should write your questions in the Q&A, and we are going to do our best to get to the questions that are posted for this session. If there's any overflow, we have another session, and we will do our very best to get to all of those questions. So Javier, start us out.
Thank you very much, Sue, and thank you everyone for listening. And delighted to be here with all the panelists, or really major stars, and I feel honored to be here. I want to begin by reiterating what Dan in the previous panel mentioned, which is we cannot count on bureaucracies to really be an important impediment to democratic backsliding. This is absolutely true, and in a chapter that I'm working on for a new book that I'm writing on Venezuela, I compare the process of democratic backsliding in Venezuela with Colombia. And for those of you who are not familiar, so at some point, one could argue Colombia was a semi-authoritarian regime, but it didn't backslide as much as Venezuela did. And I'm arguing actually that one of the key differences is, despite of what I just said, is that in the case of Venezuela, the president was able to fully colonize the bureaucracy. And in Colombia, the president wasn't able to colonize the bureaucracy. So although the bureaucrats will not be able to stand up, there is variation in the extent to which the president can or wants to colonize the bureaucracy. I'm using the term colonizing bureaucracy taken from Jan Werner Mueller's point about how populism encourages democratic backsliding. I'm talking about the Hugo Chavez government in Venezuela in the 2000s, but I'm comparing it to the Uribe administration. Uribe had far more popularity and appeal in his country, was able to get very far in restricting liberal democracy, but in the end, he didn't go far enough. He got stopped. And yes, we know the story of the courts stopping him. And an important reason the courts were able to stop him, and this was mentioned in the previous panel, is because that was one of the institutions that was not fully colonized. But there were others as well, including an economic institution important in Colombia, and that was the oil company. So there is some of that, and I have some data about it, but let's not bore you with some data. Let me say a few other things about these cases. Now, when I was a graduate student, we used to study bureaucracies as an impediment to everything that the president wanted to do, and in fact, in another country I study all the time, Cuba, every time that you ask any president, why is it that things aren't working out, they said, oh, bureaucrats and inertia and corruption. And I think there's some of that, but I think the idea is that we need to be able to be clear as scholars that when it comes to executive aggrandizement, the bureaucracy can be completely easily domesticated by the executive branch to provide not just a blank check, but enormous facilities. So, bureaucracies facilitate executive aggrandizement, even if they impede top-down directives. So you are going to automatically get the phenomenon that we fear very frequently of a bureaucracy that produces, on the one hand, authoritarianism because it facilitates aggrandizement, but also incompetent administration because of this trade-off that we mentioned between the loyalty competence. So in a country like Venezuela, where the state was able to colonize the bureaucracy fully with loyalists, you see a quick rise in autocracy and a very quick drop in policy competence. These are not separate processes, but perhaps necessary of each other. And then I want to say two more points and then I'll stop. Perhaps the most important difference between the Colombia and the Venezuela case is that there is variation in the formal powers of the president to make nominations. One of the first things that went away in Venezuela is whatever formal restraints that might have existed in Chavez's ability to nominate people in the bureaucracy. This was preserved in Colombia to a greater degree. Now, having said that, with more time, even if you have restricted rules for nominations, you can increase the loyalty of the bureaucracy, and you see it with Uribe. Uribe, with time, following norms and not doing a full colonization, was moving in the direction of greater colonization. But he went much, much more slowly, enough to be able to give time for the rest of civil society to react and offer forms of resistance. And then finally, let me say something more contemporary, not compare so much Chavez and Uribe, but a little bit the Maduro administration in Venezuela. What we have also seen, what I'm also seeing is that once executive aggrandizement is there and the bureaucracy is going along, and once you have significant levels of incompetence, it seems that presidents need to do a little bit more to get those bureaucracies to stay on board. And sort of like this is at time 2 of democratic backsliding, if you will. And what I find is that the Maduro administration really goes out of its way to provide what I call function fusion in a recent paper I wrote, which is you basically expand the powers and latitude of those bureaucrats. There comes a time where it may become necessary for this president, in order perhaps to move away from a certain degree of inertia once the regime reaches a certain point of political stability with enormous incompetence, for the president to be able to say, don't turn against me, stay with me. And this means that I have to give you far more prerogatives. One of the things that the Venezuelan regime has done is precisely to turn bureaucrats into criminals, deliberate, allow them to do that, to engage in all forms of illicit activities. Now, not all countries reach this level of permissiveness, but in many ways, one could argue is inevitable once you end up in this condition of high levels of autocracy with high levels of incompetence. You're going to have to think of an additional way of getting bureaucrats to stay on board and not abandon ship. And this can be done by expanding the opportunities for criminality. Thank you. Those were my remarks.
Thank you very much, Javier. So much to think about and to discuss later. Just a reminder to the audience, any questions that you have coming up along the way, please put them in the Q&A function. Eduardo.
Thank you very much, Sue. Thank you for the invitation. And it's great to be with so many talented and dear colleagues in this panel. So let me say, I want to share 4 ideas about this issue. And let me put some context, although Javier has already mentioned it. Latin America has changed a lot in regards to bureaucracy. We're looking much more to bureaucracy. There is more money invested in bureaucracy. Maybe it has to do with the time with democracy, the international reform agendas. But now bureaucracy is a bigger issue in Latin America, and I think that's makes this topic more interesting. We're going to see in these kind of debates about political regime, authoritarianism, and bureaucracy, more and more interesting dynamics. So let me discuss 4 ideas about this kind of dynamics. So now I think bureaucracy is going to be another arena to look for democratic conflict. This, of course, has happened in the past, but I think we're going to have more given this higher interest in bureaucracy, we'll have more interesting interaction at different levels of the state, central state and municipal level, regional, federal. But it's good to remember that it's not always good bureaucracies against autocrats. It's not that professional bureaucracies may resist more autocracy, but we will find complex dynamics. Sometimes, as Javier has showed or discussed, bureaucracies can help autocrats to advance their interests, especially because autocrats have an interest in using bureaucracies to increase their legitimacy. But also there may be, how can I call them, bad limits to power concentration. I remember this classic Muselis article about clientelism against populism. Sometimes clientelism can prevent power concentration, but not because we have great bureaucracies, but because we have clientelistic bureaucracies attached to political parties. And in Latin America, in which parties are fading, this may be a problem if you're looking into power concentration. Clientelistic bureaucracies may be less prone to control government, central government, than in the past. So it's an interesting dynamic to consider. Second, I think Javier is right. The legitimacy and opportunities and type of leader matters a lot to explore the issue. The Fujimori regime, I know the best in the past, showed that when you have a strong concentration of power, strong popularity, big legitimacy, bureaucracies can do very little to control the president, and they become tools of these powerful individuals, of powerful regimes. But also, when we have these wannabe autocrats, division of power, the division of Congress, the institutional strongholds at federal levels can also reduce and make these efforts fail. So we're going to look a lot into the conditions that allow for more or less democratic control. I don't think the argument, the old Barbara Geddes argument about parity of forces, increasing autonomy and professionalism of bureaucracy is correct. But basically what we were talking about Colombia or Venezuela in the past, you can have clientelistic bureaucracies and parity. But it certainly is going to matter for power concentration and how to look at veto points. No, also important, I think, is that the type of populist you are dealing with. No, if the populist is more right-wing oriented, we have seen with Uribe, with Fujimori, how the elites, economic elites, may not tolerate power concentration in economic instances, or they may oppose it, but be much less easygoing in regards with control of other parts of the bureaucracy. You know, the central bank remains independent, the bureaucracy respected, but not so much in other areas of the. So, I think looking at the kind of populist you have in the country, the kind of support he or she has, is very important to understand also these dynamics. Third, and also based on Javier's previous work, the best rules, the technical best rules, may not be the best rules to control autocracy. I always remember Javier's example of PDVSA, no? When the system, PDVSA management system, was inefficient, inverted commas, because it was too divided, not general management, a lot of consultation have to be made to make decisions. It was much more difficult to control. When you eased and centralized decision making, it was easier for Chavez to control it. Something similar, although we are not in the road of clear authoritarianism in Peru, but something similar we're seeing now in Peru, when a left-wing oriented government with very little previous government experience came into power. They have to try to make a lot of appointments and fail, but they failed because of an anti-technical rule passed by the previous Congress that tried to give bureaucratic stability in many areas of the state, and that rule was strongly questioned by experts that say that that will ruin meritocracy in certain areas. Somehow this has prevented bureaucratic control. Of course, there are other rules that may be better fit for any situation. Profiles for positions are also being right now a limit to executive control of bureaucracies in Peru, basically because there is something to say, hey, this guy you are trying to appoint is not adequate for the position. Finally, I think we are talking about democracy a lot in the sense of pluralism and checks and balances, but let's not forget that social democratization in unequal societies can be a very strong political tool, especially to attack bureaucracies. If bureaucracies of democratic spaces are perceived as privileged, and in countries where you have still these very strong racial disparities, bureaucracies can be attacked as saying that meritocracy or good bureaucracies are really bureaucracies highly unequal, based on unequal access and discrimination. Of course, there is a lot of rhetoric in this kind of views, because many of these leaders want to infiltrate bureaucracies. We have seen that in Bolivia, we have seen in Peru, we can see it also in Mexico, no? But this kind of argument of real democratization and real access to everyone, which is a noble argument put in the democratic sense, can also turn into a political tool to infiltrate bureaucracies. And I think bureaucracies have to be very aware that what they sometimes call meritocracy or high quality may be building unequal ways of access that can be highly make them highly vulnerable if they face a populist leader that exploits this division. This is, again, not a new issue. We have seen this kind of fighting with Stalin, the Cultural Revolution, and in less dramatic cases, in which democratization goes hand in hand with attacking the old elites. Also, the classical Bavarian bureaucracy had a lot of old elite in it, no? But I think it's something that bureaucrats have to be especially aware that they cannot be perceived as unequal agents in unequal societies. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Eduardo. That was fascinating. Next up is Gabriela Lotta from Brazil. Go ahead, Gabriela.
Okay, so thanks for the opportunity to be here to discuss the Brazilian case. I think we have a lot of similarities with the cases that have been presented so far, which is at the same time really interesting and sad. What I will present here is part of a broader research about political control and bureaucratic resistance in Brazil. We have been doing interviews with bureaucrats during Bolsonaro's presidency, and we have conducted so far more than 100 interviews with civil servants. The research is conducted by me and some colleagues, but what I will present here today is just part of a paper I'm writing with Catherine Bersch. So to start, Brazil has strong to the civil service and stability at the federal level. Public sector wages, especially at the federal level, are pretty high. And this has attracted a well-educated core of individuals from around the country, creating, as we are arguing, a bureaucratic technocracy that defends the state and the democracy. This bureaucracy was socialized in a democratic government with many institutions of participation and social control. And considering Bolsonaro's purposes of institutional dismantling and the risks of democratic backsliding imposed by him, this bureaucracy is against the president. Since the beginning of the government, this bureaucracy has resisted Bolsonaro's effort at control. They imposed many barriers to the president's project using strategies as voice, like speaking against the president in a variety of ways, as well as sabotaging certain policy efforts or even shirking to protect democratic institutions. And they were able in the beginning to diminish political interference, especially in areas with very specialized knowledge about the state, the policies, or about administrative procedures. However, our argument is that political control and bureaucratic resistance are dynamic and relational processes that involve political learning by both sides. In this way, over time, Bolsonaro's politicians learned how to maximize individual and institutionalized repercussions, and at the same time, how to reduce areas of contestation. They started using many formal mechanisms to accuse bureaucrats individually, to persecute and to silence them. One example is the laws they created imposing censorship in the bureaucracy with individual punishment. In this way, what we see is that the forms of political control and the attacks shifted from a collective to an individual level, and from the informal to the formal instruments. As a consequence, bureaucrats also learned that the individual forms of resistance would generate individual consequences, and they learned a new way to resist, using collective and institutionalized measures, such as relying on unions or activating the judicial system to protect themselves. However, these forms of resistance take time, they cost money, and many times they are not so effective. And again, observing this process as a relational one, the government is improving its political control, now using military management as a way to guarantee control and obedience. Just to have an idea, 30% of the positions right now in the whole government are occupied by individuals affiliated to the military. They are in very strategic areas, such as human resources, ethical committees, Comptroller General, and Environmental Ministry, where they are more than 90% of the positions. So military management is based on control over bodies, discipline, and a blind obedience to what chiefs request, with strong punishment for those who do not comply. This new form of political control is very effective in generating fear and paralysis among bureaucrats, as some other presenters also mentioned it. It decreases the capacity of reaction and resistance, and we are now witnessing in Brazil, Brazilian federal government, a long process of giving up and exiting by bureaucrats. So finally, seeing together this learning process of political control effectively induces bureaucrats to remain silent or loyal and to implement president's preferences, which in this case are related to institutional dismantling and democratic backsliding. To understand this whole process, it's important to remember the phrase spoken by Bolsonaro in the first weeks of his government. He said, "We have to deconstruct a lot, undo a lot of things, and then start constructing again." Bolsonaro has followed this proposal since the beginning, based on a learning process about increasingly effective actions of political control over bureaucracy. That's all for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabriela. That's fascinating. I'm sure there's going to be interest in whether the paper is available and when. Okay, so Julio is going to be our last presenter. Just remember, folks in the audience, please start thinking about questions and post them in the Q&A function, and we will turn to them after Julio's presentation.
Thank you very much, Susan. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here today. So my comments are more related to the third question set for the debate on whether successful resistance on behalf of bureaucrats can be explained more by structures rather than by specific choices of individuals. So I will make that point regarding the judiciary in Mexico, but let me first present a brief context. In Mexico, since July 2018, we have been experiencing the phenomenon of populism, a phenomenon that originates in a constitutional democracy that, according to Nadia Urbinati, combines three necessary elements: a charismatic leader, legitimately and legally elected, who uses this binary discourse between the people and the corrupt elite. And of course, the leader identifies himself and his party or movement as the vehicle through which the people will obtain the just changes that have been thwarted by the corrupted elite. So we have had this in Mexico since the last 3 years. The President Andrés Manuel López Obrador and his movement of national regeneration fit that description. I mentioned this because Mexico had not been included until recently in the set of countries that have been experiencing this phenomenon. So it is important that we think about it in these terms now. And we have seen, since the arrival of López Obrador to the presidency, attacks on the bureaucracy, defunding and budget cuts, public and very frequent attacks in the media by the president himself on bureaucrats of all kinds and levels, cooptation through forced resignations and questionable appointments of top officials, sidelining of the bureaucracy in matters that are relevant to the government, persecution or intimidation of specific individuals, sending a chilling signal to the rest, and also wholesale closings of some agencies. But interestingly, in Mexico, not all administrative agencies and autonomous state organs have been hit in the same way and with the same force or depth. Also, some agencies have been more capable to resist than others. The strength of the civil service that varies across agencies and the legal framework under which they operate, from government agencies with no autonomy to constitutionally autonomous state organs, in part explain this variation. But in the remainder of my time, I want to advance a hypothesis from a work in progress with Mariano Sánchez Talanquer. So our paper touches on one of these structural elements to try to explain resistance across bureaucracies or agencies. So the idea is the following. In some bureaucracies, patrimonialism that originated and was functional for the authoritarian regime became an obstacle to the full development of merit-based reforms to establish Bavarian bureaucracies under democracy. But interestingly, patrimonialism right now under populism might be the source of effective bureaucratic resistance. We have collected data that initially supports this hypothesis regarding specifically the Mexican federal judiciary in the last 80 years. It is to be seen if it can be expanded to other governmental agencies and autonomous constitutional organs. But what we find is that throughout the authoritarian regime in Mexico, when the Supreme Court justices had the prerogative to handpick lower court federal judges, patrimonialism developed as part of a political exchange. The judiciary would support the authoritarian regime, key decisions in key topics, for instance, while also getting in return some or huge autonomy to deal with its internal affairs. So everything from appointments and the management of judges' careers, but also the administration of material resources. The same setup was built for the armed forces and also the Catholic Church, interestingly, in Mexico. However, we find that not all Supreme Court justices under the authoritarian period were alike. There was a distinction between some more internal or core members of the judiciary, those who started young and developed their whole career inside the judiciary, and other external, more political figures who arrived at the court as one more step in the rotation of positions within the elite members of the hegemonic party. So this distinction between core and internal Supreme Court justices was also important for the appointment of people. Internal Supreme Court justices appointed more federal judges, and their appointees also advanced faster in the career. So interestingly, in the transition to democracy, this distinction between internal and external remained, and because of the peculiarities of the transition in Mexico, the bulk of the judiciary under democracy after transition was sort of dominated by these internal members. And those were the ones who started resisting the reforms, the meritocratic reforms, to establish a formal judicial career in Mexico, and a more Bavarian judicial career, if you like. They could get away with this because under democracy, as was said in the previous panel, judicial independence became a shield to face these external pressures that wanted to reform these internal aspects of the judiciary. Interestingly, the populist attacks to the judiciary in the last 3 years have been supported by some external justices, including the Chief Justice, but there has been an effective resistance being mounted by the more internal members in the Supreme Court and also inside the judiciary. So making decisions that at least stop or delay some of important reforms that President López Obrador has started to push. So I leave it here, and then we can discuss more. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Julio, and thank you to all of the panelists. You've given us an enormous amount to think about. Let's go. We have a couple of questions from the audience, so let's go first to those questions. Actually, 2 for Gabriela, but if anybody else wants to jump in also on these topics, feel free. So Marjorie Morona says, should we say that in Brazil we are experiencing a kind of institutional arrestment as a general strategy of government, even considering the huge internal variation of Brazilian bureaucracy? And I'll just go to the next one too, and you can sort of hold together responses. So again, for Gabriela, has the pressure faced, excuse me, by, sorry, this is from Maria Claudia Augusto Melendez. Has the pressure faced by Brazilian bureaucrats in office also been seen in civil service requirements of entry or entry requirements? In other words, is the Bolsonaro government also changing the rules on civil service to admit new bureaucrats more aligned with government positions? So a couple of questions on Brazil.
Okay, thanks for the questions. First, about the Marjorie's question. So what we have been seeing in Brazil, of course, the Brazilian federal government is very diverse. So it's not possible to have a general analysis about everything that is going on, because of course we have pockets of places where people just support the government, and of course these places are not under resistance and are not under political attack. But in every places that had any kind of issue in which Bolsonaro's wanted to have control, for example, environment, human rights, social assistance, health, education, that are areas where he has a very different kind of ideology. In these areas, they are doing political control over bureaucracy. But at the same time, as Marjorie mentioned it, this process is a learning process, as we have been arguing. So they selected some areas where they just started trying different forms of attack. And as soon as they realized that these forms were good ones, they were just applying these forms that they learned before in other parts of the government. So they are just spreading the kind of political control all around the government in every places that has issues where they want to control somehow. About the question from Maria Cláudia. Maria Cláudia, right now in Brazil, we are not, the government is not contracting people. They are all the processes of contracting are stopped for two years ago, since 2 years ago, because we don't have money. So we can't see systematically a change process in the way they contract people. But what is very important to understand this whole process is that they have a project right now of administrative reform. And one of the main issues of the administrative reform is that they don't want civil servants to have tenure anymore. And this attack over tenure is very important to explain the attack over bureaucracy. Because of course, as Eduardo mentioned before, bureaucrats can resist because they are tenured. Bureaucrats can resist because they are supported by the law, and they cannot, it's not simply to take them off the government. But as soon as this project is approved, they won't have any kind of resistance anymore from the bureaucracy. So, Maria Cláudia, I don't think they are changing the process of recruitment, but they are trying to change the whole process of how bureaucrats are contracted by the government with this administrative reform, which is based on the idea that the state is very expensive. So they use this idea that they have to cut expenses to change the rules and then have a weak bureaucracy.
Julio, did you want to jump in on this?
It is not on this. I have a question to Gabriela and Javier, but do you want me to make it
Yes.
now or? Yes?
Go ahead, yeah.
Okay, so because I thought it's very, very interesting this in the trade-off between loyalty and competence that we have been talking about in the previous panel and this one, and the role of militarization of public agencies in Brazil and Venezuela, because that is happening also in Mexico. So do you see militarization as breaking the trade-off so that they are both loyal and competent? And that and then also the question of time too, mentioned by Javier. So what happens when the time comes to give much more discretion to these competent and loyal bureaucrats, but who are the military? That's it.
Javier, do you want to say something on that?
Yes, I would have to say that the argument that the military was competent was mostly made by Chavez in appointing them. They really did not have, I mean, maybe it's the Venezuelan military, but they really haven't. It's kind of like the French military. They really haven't had any military success in many, many years. So it's decades, centuries. So it's hard to imagine that they would have success in running a bureaucracy and public services. But so in many ways, that actually harmed the competence of the bureaucracy. That said, that's a different question, the degree to which the military needs to be made coup-proof, because that is a very different phenomenon. How is it that one makes sure that the military does not rebel? So that's a different danger. And I also want to say one thing pertaining to Gabriela and Julio. This idea of tenure cannot be stressed enough. In Venezuela, just to give you an example, one of the things that they did was the contracting of lower level judges was done so that judges were provisional, which is the same thing as what Gabriela was saying. And this is the reason why the judicial system never challenged anything outside the law, anything committed outside the law by the executive branch.
I also was very struck by Javier's mentioning of this, the trade-off between competence and loyalty. And I think that this is a question that is very relevant to the previous panelists as well as to these. So it's the political leadership, the aspiring autocrats can behave as though they're completely indifferent to the loss of competence, and certainly that looked like it was the case in Venezuela, very tragically so. But it can come back to bite them. And I had the occasion to do a paper looking at the sort of early pandemic policy responses of governments in the Americas, and it really jumped out that the aspiring autocrats, Bolsonaro, Trump, AMLO, and a few others, were really bad at the response. Not, looking not at results and sort of, rates of death and infection and so on, because a lot goes into that, but the quality of the response was terrible. And, that played a role in Trump's losing the elections here in 2020. Bolsonaro looks like he's a little bit on the ropes in Brazil. Who knows? The next move in the playbook, of course, is to say that if I lose, then it's fraud. But I guess just putting on the table that it's not impossible that the costs that come from the loss of competence might be internalized or anticipated or felt by the political leadership. Just to sort of put that on the table. But having eaten up more than my fair share of time, there are some other questions that have come through. So let me just, a question for Julio. Apologies, we may not get to all of these, but we will try to get to all of these before the end of the full conference. Rodolfo Sarsfield asks, Julio, do you have a hypothesis on why one of the sectors of the bureaucracy attacked that AMLO has attacked most has been the universities?
Thank you. So, well, I think one of the sources one hypothesis can be found in the literature on populism, that President López Obrador has been attacking all alternative sources of legitimacy, like universities, civil society organizations, top officials, top bureaucrats with capacities, autonomous state organs. So he's attacking all those alternative sources. I would think that universities fall in that category. I don't know how has been this kind of stuff dealt with in other countries.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of that. Javier could speak to that. There was a lot of that in Venezuela as well. I think that
but this is the latest trend in populism. This attack on technocracy has now been made a flagship of populism. And Sue is right. At some point, Kurt Whalen is about to publish a paper on how populists in the end up backfiring. And part of it is what Sue was saying. This attack on technocracy will cost them somehow. They may be able to survive it, but it is not entirely in their full self-interest.
Eduardo, go ahead.
Yes, something interesting in that line that is also Whalen talking about is the weakness of political parties, no? That somehow political parties can help sustain bureaucracies, professional bureaucracies, and political leaders somehow mediate, no? But when you have populists that are pressuring for results, weak political parties, the clash is going to happen somehow, no? As Javier was saying, the technocrats in the end, in many cases, they need some time, they need some space for reform, they need some stability. this kind of leader will push, especially if they can attack them of being, again, they are like discriminating, or they are not really open to the people, blah, blah, blah. We're seeing that happen in many places. Our current president campaign using the idea that higher instances of power, and he put together regulatory agencies, constitutional court, the ombudsman office, everything was a higher echelon. So it can be very dangerous. No?
Eduardo, I was trying to remember Fujimori's relationship with university leaderships, given that he had been a rector of the university himself. Maybe you can remind us. And I have to say that I've been just as part of a research project, I've been reading closely the early campaign speeches of people like Chavez, and I was struck that Chavez's early attacks, you may not even remember this, I'm talking a long time ago, his early attacks on the university leadership was openly partisan. So the problem was not an antipathy toward technocracy, although maybe that became part of his sort of profile later. But it was that they're adecos, and that was, he was perfectly open about it. I mean that the partisan leadership was part of this corrupt old regime that was that were the counter-revolutionaries, and we have to get rid of them. But that was the nature of the attack.
Yes. So you disguise since you cannot come out saying I'm anti-technocracy, you just have to say that the technocrats are partisan. López Obrador is doing that exactly with La UNAM, saying they're neoliberals. So ascribing an ideology, a partisan ideology, because they cannot really say I'm just against expert knowledge. But yes, I remember that period. And what's so sad, Sue, is that worked. It really made people sure, yeah, we gotta really clean the institutions of adecos. And so, sure, it's a very astute observation. Thank you for making it.
The other thing that shocked me on the same period was Chavez's kind of flirtation with public employees at low-level public employees. So whereas the judges are, he describes them as almost entirely corrupt, and the political class is part of the counter-revolution, and so on and so forth. He sort of says, look, these low-level public employees don't have the power or resources to do the job that they're supposed to be doing. He's pretty clearly trying to win them over. That goes back to the question that we had earlier with sort of carrots as much as sticks.
Yeah. Creating some kind of alliance with low level, street level, I think was the word that Barbara was using, bureaucrats.
All right, so we have several other questions. Marjorie Marona, for Javier, do you think that the analytical category of autocratic legalism could brave or provoke this idea of bureaucratic, I think maybe resist or provoke this idea of bureaucratic resistance?
Well, one of the things I should have mentioned when I wrote about autocratic legalism is that in presidential systems, and especially in Latin America, where constitutions exist giving so much power to the state, these constitutions are usually written so that the president has enormous prerogative in rewriting the regulations of the bureaucracy. If there's one area where there's almost very little checks and balances, is in the production of regulations and rules of bureaucracies. And this, I think, is the one way that autocratic legalism can fight bureaucratic resistance, because you just change the norms. We saw it in the United States, that one of the first things that the Trump administration did is to then convert Homeland Security into an instrument of anti-immigration policy far more by just changing the regulations of what they need to enforce. And this is, I don't know if this is true of non-presidential systems or at least presidential systems in Latin America, but one of the drawbacks of Latin American constitutions constantly talking about the importance of states providing, is that they are very silent on ways to lessen autocratic legalism by presidents in rewriting norms and regulations that bureaucrats need to observe.
Okay, that's fabulous. Thank you. So we have probably time for maybe one or possibly two more questions. E. Brodkin has a question for Gabriela and others, anyone who wants to jump in. Interesting to hear about dynamics of bureaucratic control and resistance at higher levels of government, but we know that much of the practical work of government takes place at the street level. So this is going back to an issue that was discussed in the first panel, where policing, provision of health, education, and human welfare takes place. Can you discuss how street level bureaucrats figure in your analysis of possibilities for bureaucratic resistance? So again, Gabriela or any of the panelists who'd like to address that.
Okay, I can start. So thank you for the question. We were discussing before the panel that Brazil has and Brazilian Federation creates an environment of resistance in local level and state level against the president. So most of street level bureaucrats in Brazil are connected to the local levels. So the president can say bad things about them, but they cannot, he cannot threaten them directly, because he does not have the instruments against this kind of bureaucracy. But what we are seeing, Evelyn, in street level bureaucracy is that the president's speeches, for example, against vaccines, against any measures of the pandemic, is affecting directly the street level bureaucrats, because citizens became a way to use the president's speeches against the street level bureaucrats. So it's not that the presidents attack them directly, but the presidents gives resources to citizens to attack street level bureaucrats, and they are suffering a lot. For example, when they ask people to use masks and people say no, but the president said that masks are useless. The president said that vaccines are very dangerous, things like that. So what the president is doing is improving the ways that citizens have to attack the bureaucracy and not directly attacking them. This is a horrible situation, of course, because working at the street level is very hard. And when you don't have the political support, is even worse. And this also helps explaining, as Susan mentioned before, the Brazilian tragedy in facing the pandemic, because we have the president against street level bureaucrats who are facing the pandemic directly.
So just to pick up on that, Gabriela, I'm going to jump in here. Is it not the case that has really those bad results have really hurt Bolsonaro, as well as economic downturn, and are part of the backdrop against which he seems to face a difficult re-election? So is he not harmed by this trade-off, this sort of opting for loyalty over competence?
Yeah, it is. But what he's doing is he's governing for the 20% of citizens that are loyal to him. And these people are very, how can I say, they are not in the middle of the decisions, like they are in the extremes of everything. And he's all the time governing for the extremes. So that's why he needs bureaucrats very loyal to him, because there's no rationality, no economic rationality in the way they make decisions. For example, we always say in Brazil that if Bolsonaro just supported the how to face the pandemic, like supported vaccines, because we have a very large health system that could just face the pandemic, he would gain this election easily next year. But he decided to govern to these very extreme people that support him. And this helps explaining, Susan, why he's losing support from the rest of the population that is not so radical as these people is. So
it sounds all too familiar from a US perspective. Does anybody else want to jump in on this issue of kind of street level bureaucrats, or people who are sort of really directly providing the services, as opposed to higher level folks in the bureaucracy, and how that plays with the aspiring autocrats, Ms. Brodkin's question. Or any other, we have time for like sort of one more half comment. So go ahead, Gabriela.
Just one point about the process of militarization that Julio mentioned it before. I think that we have to think about this process of militarization, not only about putting people, members from the military inside the government, but it's a way to manage. And this way to manage is based on discipline, loyalty, patterns of management, you know, like it's not only bringing people inside the government, but also about creating an environment where people do not make any kind of decision. They just obey, they are disciplined, and they have individual punishment. And I think that this is going on in Brazil in all areas of the government and probably in other countries also. And I think this is a very interesting phenomenon to analyze.
Julio, 2 seconds, you're on mute.
Just to complement what Gabriela just said, in Mexico, that is happening. And also the addition, I mean, whenever the military takes over one agency or area of government, they argue internal security or state security for being more opaque and do not disclose a lot of information that was public before in that very same agency. And so that also increases discipline. Internal discipline.
So I want to just thank you so much to our panelists. Fantastic, interesting. I wish we had more time. Those were great presentations and great responses. Don't go anywhere, folks. We're going to take a quick 5-minute break. And our last panel is going to be, we're bringing in 2 experts on the US, my Chicago colleague, Will Howell, who is an expert on the US presidency, and Walter Schaub from the Project on Government Oversight. And they're going to kind of reflect, along with me, we're going to reflect on what we've learned in part from the US perspective. So back in 5 minutes, and again, thank you to the panel. Hi, folks. Welcome back. I'm delighted to turn the moderating role over to my colleague, Will Howe. Will, take it away.
All right, Sue. And we're going to give you a break from moderating, but only to put you back into a seat so we can learn more from you. You've done so much work in this space. And I'm really excited to hear your reflections on this fascinating conversation this morning. I've learned so much. And we're going to be joined in conversation with Walt Schaub, who leads the Project on Government Oversight's Government Ethics Initiative, which focuses on preventing abuses of government power and resources, reforming government ethics systems, and holding government officials accountable. And is just it's just a wealth of expertise about what's happening at the intersection of politics and the administrative state in our own country, and is a deeply thoughtful individual. I'm Will Howell. I'm a political scientist. I study American politics and have the great pleasure of running and directing the Center for Effective Government. And we care a lot about democracy. We care also a whole lot about the capacity of a government to solve problems, and the administrative state stands at the very center of those considerations. And so looking at a world in which democratic backsliding, which is happening with greater frequency here in the United States and abroad, is one that calls into question the capacity of administrative state to actually deliver and attend to the interests and wishes and wants of a people. And, reflecting back on the conversation this morning, I'm struck by, actually, I'm kind of reassured that a couple of intuitions that we had in coming together are affirmed. Reassured in the sense that this is a worthwhile conversation, not reassured at all in terms of the state of our world and our country. One, in recognizing that when thinking about the health of democracy and the incidence of democratic backsliding, that the bureaucracy and the administrative state decidedly is implicated. At the front end, so you noted that this is a topic that has not received as much attention as we think it ought to receive. And boy, it is clear the bureaucracies around the globe are put in the crosshairs when we think about rising autocrats and their ambitions. I'm also struck by the variability within countries and and across countries in what these strategies look like. And the dynamics in play. One of the things that I think came through very clearly in Gabriela's discussion that just happened, and it carried through in a lot of people's discussions, is that these aren't kind of fixed phenomenon that kind of land all at once. They play out over time, and there's a kind of experimentation, a logic in the rollout of efforts by would-be autocrats to capture, in some instances, the administrative state, in other instances, sabotage it. And then I'll simply say one last thing before I open it up for some conversation here, which is that we as Americanists who were caught flat-footed in 2016 and have been reeling ever since and trying to make sense of what's going on domestically have just a ton to learn about what these dynamics look like when we think about the rise of populism, the rollback of the administrative state. And so just tremendously enriching conversation. Thank you all. And what a thrill it is to have people from all across the globe joining in. And I thought what we might do in this last panel is to sort of do a couple of things. One is raise some general lessons that we heard from the conversation and from our own research. And then also tie back some of the observations that people have made to what's happening domestically. As Sue mentioned earlier, in the spring, we had a whole panel that's part of this series devoted to the Trump presidency. And I think there was just an awful lot for the Americanists in the audience, myself included, that was just sort of resonating locally. And a place to start is to think about the stakes involved when we think about attacks on the administrative state. What are the stakes involved as they relate to democracy? That the attacks are not just a marker of a larger phenomenon, but they present themselves as a kind of a bulwark of something much larger. They have implications for other things that are going on with attacks on the bureaucracy. Excuse me, not the attacks on the bureaucracy implicate attacks on the judiciary, and that tie in efforts to roll back the free and independent press. And then also they matter in their own right. And And Walt, if we could bring you in, this is something that you've you've worried a lot about. We saw at the tail end of the Trump administration efforts to reclassify significant portions of the civil service as political appointees. And if you could give us your own sense and speak a little bit about your own sense about what's at stake when we think about attacks on what would otherwise be thought of as an independent administrative state when we think about the health of democracy.
Sure. You know, I was absolutely fascinated by a lot of the things said in the last two panels and a little bit terrified at how much they resembled things happening here. One of the key features of the attack on the administrative state in the last administration was the kind of trial and error that you talked about. This administration was probably the most unsophisticated, the least prepared to lead that I'd ever encountered. The agency that I led, the Office of Government Ethics, is a place I'd been for a long time before I led it, and we worked with past administrations coming in, and they always brought in experts who had experience leading and experience standing up White House offices. This team brought in those folks, and they actually did a great job preparing. They were surprisingly earnest in their efforts to prepare. And then, as often happens with these kind of authoritarian movements, personalities dominate, and they simply fired all of these people we'd spent 5 months training the day after the election. And what became clear with the people who remained was their absolute bewilderment at what they were supposed to do to run a government. And you saw that as well in some of the attacks on the civil service. It began with the priming of the public for this, with Trump coining the phrase the deep state, or at least making use of it if he didn't coin it. And they tried a number of clumsy things. First, they tried to merge the Chief Human Resources Agency for the executive branch, the Office of Personnel Management, which oversees a population of 2 million or more federal employees, with an agency that runs the government's real estate and some of its purchasing systems. And they had nothing to do with each other. And the effort was so clumsy that Republicans, including Mark Meadows, who later became the White House Chief of Staff, sort of mocked it in hearings, and it went nowhere because it was so unthought out. But what was really behind it in the fine details was that they were going to pull the regulatory authority of that agency out of the merged agency and put it closer to the president in the executive office of the president. And that was the only part of the merger they actually cared about. There were a number of similar things, like leaving vacancies in the agency that provides hearings to allow employees to challenge firings, rolling back union activity in agencies, intervening politically in career employees' disciplinary actions, which had been unthinkable before that. And then ultimately, they finally cracked the code in October 2020 when they came up with this new thing called Schedule F, which was a new category of federal employees, and it could strip them of their appeal rights so that you could now fire them at will. And that sets you up to return us to the spoils system of the 19th century, when corruption just flourished and the quality of government services was very low. And I think the next time an administration like that takes over, they'll start with that playbook and won't take 4 years to learn how to do it. So to avoid filibustering, which I'm opposed to these days, I'll pause there.
But did you find comfort early on in the failures of the administration as they flailed about, and then become increasingly concerned over time as they set their sights squarely on a move that would have real purchase? That is the reclassification of significant portions of the civil service.
So in the earliest days, I was really concerned about their clumsiness because the nation's at its most vulnerable during a presidential transition. And if we'd had a natural or man-made disaster or an enemy attack or something like that, the government would have been hampered in its ability to respond. Once they finally got their act together and started standing up something of a government, though they left so many positions vacant, I became somewhat comforted at the sheer clumsiness of their efforts. And you saw even things where they were rolling back regulations, they would lose lawsuits over them. I mean, they actually were really terrible at their stated goals. They weren't good at the actual political items that they set out to achieve, except for maybe packing the courts. But they still had a destructive effect on democracy and on the bureaucracy. And I always felt that the bureaucracy would be able to hold out about 4 years. And they held out longer than the inspectors general did. They held out longer than Congress did in its oversight capacity. They held out longer than the FBI did in its investigative capacity. And so they really became sort of the last line of defense. And just to clarify what I mean by that, I don't think that bureaucracy has the power to do things that subvert a president or initiate things that are contrary to his or her agenda, but they have the ability to be a speed bump, to slow things down. If you give somebody an unlawful order, we have a law that protects them. And if you fire them for political reasons, they have appeal rights. And I felt that those protections meant that the people supportive of that president would not achieve their goal of turning the executive branch completely into one body controlled by the president, where each employee is an arm or a leg of the president and completely obedient. And that meant that unlawful orders were going to be illegal. Near the end, we saw that start to break down. We had the employees in the Office of Management and Budget, which is technically in the executive office of the president, although it's a distinct agency and employs a lot of career employees, carried out an illegal order to suspend the payment of hundreds of millions of dollars worth of aid to Ukraine to help the president extort them into interfering in our elections. And those are career employees who still work there for the most part, who carried it out. 2 resigned, any political appointees left, but there were plenty of career employees there who were culpable. The somewhat humorous irony is that they were the first ones Trump was targeting with putting into this new Schedule F. So while I was very alarmed by Schedule F, there was a little bit of dark pleasure in the whole live by the sword, die by the sword kind of thing, that these were the ones targeted first, although I really didn't want to see him succeed in firing them.
Yeah. So you've done so much work in thinking about the kind of many dimensions of democratic backsliding and the kind of various frontiers at which democracies thrive or not, or otherwise. And you led our discussion this morning by pointing out that we as a discipline of political science and public administration ought to do more in paying attention to attacks on the administrative state. And I wonder if you might just say a little bit about your thoughts in hearing this morning's conversation, again, about these stakes involved. How do we think about how the kinds of phenomena that are playing out here figure into the larger phenomenon that is democratic backsliding?
You know, I think that and I can't claim to be an expert in systems other than our own, but particularly from the things that were said today and the fact that you see this isn't just a United States condition. This is happening in places all over the globe. I think that it is increasingly clear that although they experiment and test and try different ways, there is a consistency and sort of a self-reinforcing nature in this recognition that the administrative state is somehow the enemy. You see Steve Bannon, who's tried to set up training camps in Italy for, I don't know what he calls them, I call them fascists, always rails against the administrative state and says his mission in life is to destroy it. Well, I don't think it's because a guy like Steve Bannon particularly cares about companies that are regulated by anti-pollution laws. I think it's because he sees them as a bulwark against authoritarian overreach. And on his side, helping him, is every president we've had in recent memory. I mean, Trump drove us towards authoritarianism on a highway at 120 miles an hour. But it's not like the current president has turned the car around. He slowed it to maybe 15 or 6 miles an hour. And I'll give you just a couple brief examples. One is Congress tried to close the loophole that allowed Trump to get away with extorting Ukraine. It wanted to require more disclosure to Congress and more affirmative disclosure requirements about the apportionment of appropriated funds, because there's always some wiggle room in the funds Congress appropriates to the executive branch. And within the executive branch, they apportion the money among different agencies, theoretically consistent with the parameters Congress sets, but sometimes they push the envelope because that's what they do. And so Congress wanted more reporting. And the White House has pushed back, even in this administration, saying, oh, it would just be too burdensome to give you that information. But that's not true at all, because they have an internal intranet that between agencies that gathers this data, and they brag about how they can print it out in different ways. So much so that when I built an electronic filing system for the executive branch, instead of starting from scratch, we built it on their platform and leveraged that. And they're very proud of it. But then Congress shows up and says, we want more data. And they're like, oh, that's too hard. We might have to reach over and push a button. And so there's this resistance to that. Or the White House helped fight against a subpoena to President Trump's former White House counsel, Don McGahn, to prevent Congress from having him appear at a public hearing to be questioned about the things that came out in the Mueller report. Well, the Mueller report was almost 400 pages, and most Americans didn't read it. And they weren't going to read a transcript of an interview of Don McGahn. So they wanted to put him on camera and ask him details about this with the world watching. And the White House fought and succeeded in getting Congress to concede that they would do a behind closed door deposition, and a transcript came out and nobody read it. You would even have to do some work to find it. And so I think one of the things that we may see in other places is that there are certain systems in place that create a natural tension where the people in charge are always pushing for more authority. And we depend on these kind of checks that we always brag about. But currently in our country, the legislative branch is broken as a check on the executive branch. It's not even losing the war, it has lost the war. And unless it passes some new laws creating new mechanisms, it's not going to regain power. And I really think a president who wants to push the envelope on even beyond what President Trump did, or perhaps President Trump in a second term, will succeed in going much, much further. And so, again, I think the bureaucracy can serve in all of these countries, it sounds like, as a speed bump to slow that. But it's kind of like the Spartans at Thermopylae. You're gonna slow them down to give the armies back home time to gather, or in this case, not armies, but Congress to resume its authority to do oversight. But it can't do more than slow. And so I think that the destruction we're seeing is broader than just an attack on the democracy, but I think there's a certain sophistication to people who otherwise seem kind of thuggish in understanding that if they first attack the speed bump, first clear this obstacle out, they can move fast enough that it'll be harder for other systems that defend democracy to strengthen themselves.
Thank you, Walt. If I could come, Sue, to you with basically the same question. How are we to think about these phenomena that we've been describing fitting into a larger project of autocratic consolidation?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks, Walt, for those really interesting reflections. The word playbook has become almost a cliche in this space. And yet it's really, there is something about it. There's something about if you are you gain, you become president, you become prime minister, and you really want to consolidate basically all power around yourself and your office, and you're quite happy to put an end to democracy. There are certain things moves you're going to make, and those moves you're going to make in whether you're in Brazil or Turkey or the US. And one of those moves is to attempt to turn the bureaucracy at high levels, at street level, into a kind of loyal agent of your project. And that frequently, you can imagine loyal and competent versions of those people, but frequently, as Javier was suggesting in the last session, there's a trade-off, and so you end up with a less competent bureaucratic apparatus, and that played out in Venezuela with the kind of the putting in place of in the PDVSA, in the oil company, of very in positions that required real expertise and experience, people who didn't have it, and that contributed to this terrible tragedy of a relatively wealthy middle income country becoming a very poor and very destroyed economy. I guess there's competence in the bureaucracy, and there's also competence of the political leadership, and that's what Walt was alluding to. So here in the U.S., I think we sighed occasional sighs of relief at the lack of competence of the political leadership, and it was Trump and his people were really bad at things that they wanted to get done. Walt alluded to the deregulation, the push to deregulation that just fell afoul of the Administrative Procedures Act over and over and over again, until they got a little better at it. And I think things started, getting better from their perspective. And at the same time, we sort of thought, oh my goodness, what if the next version of this person who is willing to destroy our democracy is a lot more competent in terms of the politics of it? And that's a frightening thought. And by the way, we are by no means out of the woods here in the United States, because we have an electorate whichever side you're on is going to be convinced that the other side cheated when the next national elections come around. So that is a terrifying thought as well. So on a more positive note, I would think that people like Will and Walt would hear the stories of places like Poland and Hungary and Mexico and Turkey and so on, and think, wow, it could be worse. And that is one of the things that is both a kind of an observation to make, but also a kind of a question that we need to address. So they pull from the same playbook, they make the same moves, so Steve Bannon talks about the dark state, which conveys a kind of partisan capture of the state. A very typical alternative story is a corrupt state. So, Julio was talking about about AMLO in Mexico. He runs for office saying, in the history of Mexico, from the conquest to today, we have never had so much corruption, which is baloney. There's plenty of corruption in Mexico, no question about it. But the idea that we are at the apex of corruption, and they're all corrupt, and that is my excuse for attacking the public administration. So that's the playbook, but it works better. It's easier for an AMLO to push that through than it is for a Trump. And what are the things that stopped Trump? Well, one of the things was that he wasn't very good. He and his people were not very good at what they were trying to do, or they didn't seem to think that they needed to think about details, or whatever it was that kept them from being very good at it. But another is there, as shocking as it was to see an internal attack on American democracy from the leadership of one of our major political parties, it was also, a story of it that not really working as well as it had in other places. So it's sort of like, they try the same thing, but Turkey is at kind of an intercept, or Russia is an intercept down here. It was an intercept down here, and the US is up here. So it's just harder to undo 200 years of democracy in which you have a very rich associational life. You have professional organizations, you have all kinds of speed bumps that are going to stop that from happening very quickly. Now the intercept was very different, but I worry a lot about the slope on this. You know, we came down very, very far, and we're still very much in trouble.
And Walt gave this vaunted administrative state that enjoys all kinds of legal protections, that has plays such a vital role in American politics. He gave them 4 years, right, to be able to meaningfully hold out. And that in the face of what is widely recognized as a broadly incompetent administration. And so there's reason decidedly to worry. I want to emphasize sort of, and maybe draw out, if we might, a tension that's built into the playbook, which and it came through in our discussions of loyalty on the one hand and expertise on the other, and the trade-offs involved, but it plays out in another way, which is that to the extent that a thing that that a populist demagogue would like to do, a would-be autocrat would like to do, is kind of delegitimize the experts and marginalize their influence and kind of clear the way. I mean, to get rid of the speed bump that's before them. And they do that through their rhetoric. They do that through their efforts to politicize. They do that by trying to sabotage the state in all kinds of ways, right? That's one part of the playbook. But there's this other thing that came through in our conversation from the very first presentation that Tim Frye provided, which is that the administrative state represents a threat, but it also is a resource to an autocrat. That these are individuals who can be mobilized in the service of one's political ascendance. They have a kind of expertise that can be needed in the face of a pandemic. And so one can think about like how, one might argue, I would argue that on net, the fumbled response by the Trump administration was the primary reason why they ended up losing re-election. And that the administrative state in some ways, in some moments, can serve the purposes of legitimating a rule, at least for some audiences. And so we've got this like tension that's built in. On the one hand, it's the thing to be marginalized, attacked, and sabotaged. And on the other hand, it's this thing that one needs if one is going to effectively rule, not just to rise to rule, but actually continue to successfully rule and meet the challenges that are put before them. And that's kind of schism is something which is unresolved, which may be part of the reason why when we talk about, there's one thing to talk about democratic backsliding. There's another thing to think about, well, how long can somebody like Trump actually hold power over the long haul when stable governance requires in the modern era a robust administrative state that actually can deliver. And if not the administrative state, then what? Because one's personal rule isn't going to, in the longer run, serve as a meaningful substitute. I don't know what you all think.
You know, I tend to think you're right about the pandemic is what changed administrations. I think there was enough momentum of outrage over Trump's corruption that maybe a challenger would have had a chance, but odds were still, I think, slightly in his favor. And then I think you lose hundreds of thousands of people to a disease due to the obvious incompetence of the response. You're gonna shift the balance a lot. And a few interesting things came out. You know, in the last two presentations, they were talking a lot about the sort of paradox that as you gain more control that way, quality goes down and then people get frustrated because government services are more inept. I was surprised at how quickly it became inept. That was probably, I think, the most surprising thing, was that the ineptitude affected the career officials in dealing with the pandemic. The White House got so heavily involved in the pandemic. Jared Kushner was running a shadow pandemic team. Political appointees were changing the messages coming out of CDC. That I had not expected. And I don't think anybody could have imagined that in 2020 and 2021, the CDC's credibility would be shattered so badly. I mean, this was sort of the most highly esteemed agency that we all trusted. And now they managed to undermine that surprisingly quickly, because again, who's at the top does matter. I think in some ways we also got a little bit lucky that Trump was so corrupt, because if we'd had a more principled authoritarian who's driven by an ideology, he might have been able to channel that energy. He was so focused on making money for himself and benefiting himself in every way he could. And you expect corruption to come with authoritarianism. But I guess at the early stages, there's a limit to how much corruption you can have if it's going to be effective. So we had that going for us. I think on the other hand, I think there's a story that wasn't noticed much by the general public. And it was the story of Trump's appointee near the end of the Trump administration to the US Agency on Global Media, which used to be the Broadcasting Board of Governors, which oversees Voice of America and several other federal media agencies. And his name was Michael Pack, and he was very ruthless, very ideological, very disciplined. He was the Steve Bannon associate. He went in there and illegally fired a bunch of people, and it took them a long time to win cases and get their jobs back. And he broke down the wall between the objectivity of reporting and his political agenda. Now VOA is, in a sense, a propaganda outfit, but its propaganda was that it was going to provide objective reporting and sell democracy by saying, look what you can get when you have objective reporting. He wanted it to be a more traditional propaganda outfit, sort of the Russian variety, an American RT. And in some ways, I think people miss the story because VOA, Voice of America, is so irrelevant to our lives and such a small thing. It's not allowed to broadcast in the US precisely because it is technically a propaganda outfit. But I think that one of the things you can say about these authoritarians is they think bigger and are more creative in their dastardly efforts. And I wouldn't put it past them if they'd had another 4 or 12 years to turn that into a significant presence and really use that as a way to build support externally and maybe eventually internally for an agenda. And I think we are consistently caught off guard because we failed to appreciate their sort of ruthless creativity. And I have been very frustrated. I perceive this administration as oblivious to a lot of the threats. And I think there's always going to be a disequilibrium where the people who value traditional norms and structures are going to often try to play by old rules that were not built to be able to combat this level of creativity. But they too face a paradox, because if they go too far outside of their traditional approaches, they are inadvertently helping the erosion of norms and traditions. So there is a balancing act to be made, and none of us knows, I think, for sure where the balance is to be found. I personally think it could be found in a place much more aggressive than currently is. But then again, I also think this administration needs to break free of this constant march toward more executive power, because you're just priming the system for the next authoritarian to continue to get away with things. So anyways, I highly recommend anybody who's doing studies in this area to take a close look at Michael Pack and US Agency on Global Media as a case study.
Thanks, Walt. So can we turn to you with the same issue? You said, well, hey, Americanists, maybe you can feel good that you've got company and that actually things could be worse. I'm not sure I do feel good about that. I actually think like, oh boy, I don't wish that upon other countries. And I think, that one can get worse is of real concern. But could we think about, can we call it a flaw in the playbook that the move to talk about sabotaging the administrative state while yielding immediate political gain and leading to the ascension of an autocrat ultimately leads to their undoing, because ultimately they need to deliver. And in order to deliver the services and address the wants and needs of a populace, you need the equivalent of a modern administrative state. And having undermined that which will ultimately sustain your rule, you're left politically vulnerable. Does that notion provide you any comfort?
Yes and no. Sorry, yes and no. So you could tell a happy story where you get these aspiring autocrats who are still under a democratic constraint of needing to win a future election. So they don't just say, game over, that's the last election we're going to have. They know that they're going to have to face another election. So they have to be sensitive to public opinion. And the public, whatever else they care about, they'll care about, good outcomes in the economy and certain level of social service provision that they're accustomed to or expect or even might want to see more of. And so the aspiring autocrat comes in and replaces the bureaucracy with a bunch of loyalists, and those loyalists are just bad at what they do, and therefore the outcomes that the population pays attention to are bad, and then they get voted out. Well, it doesn't always work that way, and I think that is a good story to tell about Trump to some extent. Granted, what Walt has reminded us that they just also weren't very politically competent. I think Gabriela agreed with me that was kind of the story of Brazil. I mean, Bolsonaro has been pretty popular until recently, and he is very much being attacked, as you may have followed the recent congressional decision there to accuse him legally of a kind of genocide because of because he basically decided that they were going to go for herd immunity and caused hundreds of thousands of people to die. The problem is that they're not always so there is such a thing as a bureaucrat, let's say more of a mid-level or higher level appointee who is both loyal and competent. If you were going to be the next Trump and try to be more successful, you would look for those people, and you would develop a tolerance for people quietly telling you when you're screwing up. So, the people who are going to be faithfully going to the press and saying, yes, President Schaub did a great job with this and this and this, but are privately going to be saying, hey, this didn't work out very well. Let's do a better job on this. So that's possible. And then at the lower level, it's also possible to give people, these sort of street level bureaucrats, as we've been calling them, job security, maybe some, salary gains, maybe some additional powers of the kind that Javier was talking about in Venezuela, of a very nefarious type in that case. But I don't think that happy formula is inevitable. And actually, we see a lot of these people getting reelected. Now, think about Hungary. Viktor Orban and the Fidesz party was reelected, granted under rules that had been changed and gerrymandering that had happened. So they actually did lose some votes, but that didn't translate into a loss of seats. And of course, it's a parliamentary system. Yeah, you'd like to think that there's a built-in kind of self-correction device. But I don't think you can count on it. And I'm very worried about, what Walt is saying, that there's a kind of a learning that's going on. I mean, the three of us could, and I'm sure others on the panel could come up with a list of names of people who we think would be just as autocratic and a lot more clever, just thinking about, say, the governors and maybe some senators and so on. And so they may have learned a little bit of this lesson. And the other part of the learning process that's terrifying is, we had, thank goodness for our election administrators who proved themselves to be professionals for the most part and to resist extreme pressure sometimes directly from the President of the United States to falsify an election result in 2020. And I took great heart in that. I'm sure many other political scientists did as well. But then people started saying, hey, they're just going to start replacing these people, and the state legislatures are going to abrogate to themselves legally the role of certifying elections or the ability not to. So there was a pretty quick learn, and it's not automatic.
I guess I'd like to play with that idea that you both have put forward. And, we at the Center for Effective Government, we joined forces with Protect Democracy to put out a whole series of essays on the administrative state. Walt was kind to contribute one. They've just come out over the last couple of weeks, reflecting on threats to the administrative state, need for reform. And I wrote one that came out yesterday with my regular co-author and friend Terry Moe, that was suggesting that an important dimension in thinking about attacks within the United States on the administrative state is that there's a partisan valence to them. This came up earlier, I think Eduardo raised it, about the importance of ideology playing a role in shaping the efforts by, again, a would-be autocrat, and it's almost always a he, in his efforts to control or sabotage a state. And a thing to be said, it seems to me, about the US context in this regard is that not all presidents have the same relationship to the administrative state, because the administrative state in the main is a state was built by Democrats, that is serving big D democratic objectives in the main, not uniformly, of course, but in the main. It's born of the New Deal and the Great Society. And that is disproportionately staffed by big D Democrats. And that one of the things that's happened, and this goes back, this is a story of learning that goes back not to the beginning of the Trump administration, but goes back to the Nixon administration, is that they look out at this big administrative state and they look out at, and they see enemies everywhere. And they say, what can we do about it? And the legislative process is not affording any meaningful relief, because Congress, for all kinds of reasons, is a disaster. That there's a capacity for the administrative state to offer a resistance and to push back. And the Democratic Party stands ready to defend the administrative state, not at every step, but in the main, they're willing to do so. They want to do so. And so part of what I think that we're seeing within the US, when we think about, it's not an accident that Trump is a Republican, and that Trump, not just by virtue of his own personal ambitions, but because of the party that he inhabits and the posture he assumes vis-a-vis this administrative state that's built in and is very hard to move, is then looking for ways to claim new powers and to sabotage and assault a thing that is very hard, to move. And that's part of the dimension. That's an important part of the story that we need to grapple with domestically, and I suspect is playing out in Latin America and in Europe and as well in various ways. Does that resonate with either of you?
Well, I one of the most fascinating rhetorical games that Trump played was to turn the definition of corruption sort of on its head. Because these are agencies that perform services he doesn't like EPA or Social Security or something like that, doing their job is perceived as partisan. And just like one of the things we heard in the session on Latin America, he couldn't come right out and say, I hate experts. I hate people who know what they're doing. And so he portrayed them as political. And so you had both sides screaming, drain the swamp, and they both meant something completely different. On one side, it meant end corruption, and on the other side, it meant end people who disagree with us. And it was more focused on political agenda. That weirdly proved super duper effective, though. I mean, it was so baffling to see the most corrupt administration in history gaining real traction with the phrase drain the swamp, until you realize what they really mean is drain people who oppose our authoritarian ambitions out of government. One of the unique features of the federal workforce, though, is that although polls may reveal a higher percentage of people leaning one way than the other politically, the workforce is extremely nonpartisan. I've worked in nonprofits, in a law firm, in government, and I was amazed in all of my outside government experiences where people would talk politics in the workplace. Nobody talks politics in the workplace in the federal government. Nobody even hints at the political implications of their work. It's a very mission-focused workforce, and more senior employees will chastise younger employees if they hear them come in and haven't absorbed the culture yet. On the other hand, the workforce is not a monolith, and there really are pockets that are deeply supportive of President Trump. We saw this with the Customs and Border Patrol Agency. Their union leader was saying shockingly partisan things while on the clock, and he got away with it by saying it was union activity and I was using official time to do it. And that kind of partisanship was embraced. And so ultimately there was this transformation down the line where you saw people not objecting to partisanship in government. They objected to partisanship that didn't support their party view in government, which is anathema to the government culture itself. But I think it's the direction he wants to push it in. All of this leads you back to the spoils system, where new president clears out the workforce and you bring in a bunch of inexperienced, incompetent loyalists who are amenable to corruption if it's done in the name of party goals. And so I think that has repercussions even beyond just the shift away from democracy to more failures like we saw in the pandemic, where hundreds of thousands died. And I think a really dangerous thing that you can see playing out right now is that the public isn't traumatized, as individuals are, but as a whole, the public isn't traumatized by having 700,000 of our fellow country people dead as a result of a pandemic. You see still more horror about 3,000 dying during 9/11, or tens of thousands dying in past wars. But we've lost, before it's done, we may lose 1 million people. And the reaction to that isn't what it should be and won't be sustained. And I think all of that is reflective of the political environment we're in, where perhaps technical failures will be forgiven in the name of partisan loyalty.
We have a question from a fellow panelist that's come in. If I could read it. This is from Dan Kelemen. I'd be curious to hear more about what the panelists make of the role of federalism in this context. Some scholars, such as Jake Grumbach, have recently argued that federalism, i.e. the manipulation of elections by corrupt state officials, plays a key role in helping aspiring autocrats. But other legal scholars, i.e. Landau et al., take a more Madisonian approach and argue that decentralization of some key functions, i.e. election administrators, so you just mentioned them, make it harder for an aspiring autocrat like Trump to rig an election to perpetuate his rule. How ought we to think about, just generally, I mean, it could be about federalism, it could be about decentralization of authority and the extent to which it exists as being either a bulwark against the efforts of a would-be autocrat to claim and consolidate authority, or providing all kinds of points of entry for the corruption of a political system.
So there is some research on this, and my own take on it is that the arguments can run in both directions, and the logic of it can run in both directions, but that on the whole, federalism is, I like Walt's image of the speed bump, at least. And that is because there for reasons that maybe have to do with commitment to democracy, may have to do with partisanship, may have to do with whatever reasons, you have powerful subnational leaders who can be a counterweight and represent real resistance to the actions of the aspiring autocrat. We certainly saw that in the United States, and the governors of the country kind of generally fell into either they became Trump acolytes, or they became people who tried to keep government running well and through the Trump years, and also maybe took advantage of opportunities, political opportunities, career opportunities that Trumpism opened up among people who were horrified by Trumpism. Gabriela mentioned that in Brazil as well. I know during the pandemic, just as it was the case here, the federal administration, the central government, abdicated its responsibility entirely in Brazil, just as worse than that. I mean, really pushed very harmful practices and policies. And state governors, who are quite powerful in Brazil, stepped in, state governments stepped in and had, in many cases, very reasonable kind of policy responses. On the other hand, for that reason, and just because they don't want to be constrained by anyone, any kind of actor, the cleverer among the aspiring autocrats come in, and right from the get-go, they are trying to undermine the position of the governors and state subnational administrations. Mexico is a great example. AMLO is able to say, look, the PRI and the PAN, the two large traditional political parties, are mafias of power, and therefore we need to get rid of the leaderships at the state level. And just a kind of a footnote to that, there's enough truth to it that it's very palatable to a lot of the public. I mean, if you find yourself in a position of sort of saying, no, there's not so much corruption in Mexico, you're going to sound like an idiot. Or if you find yourself in the position of saying, no, these American, politicians aren't driven by crass partisanship, you also are going to sound like a dum-dum. And what Walt said earlier about the political practices of public sector workers in the U.S., it's really important, and it's important to that people know that. I'm writing a book, the working title of which is Trash Talking Democracy, which is sort of about how the kind of cultural assault on democracy that is a kind of that assists the institutional assault on it. And trash talking democracy, part of what it means is saying the entire public sphere is full of people who are rogues. They're not professionals, and they're certainly not angels. They're all rogues. And that plays on our uncertainty. We don't know. I mean, I don't know, the private behavior of my member of Congress, or, the local judges. I have to kind of look them up when I read about them in the newspaper. And I'm a political scientist. So the general public does not know. They know that there are scandals and that some of these people are corrupt and some of them are partisan, or it's like party hacks. So if you tell them, oh, that they're all that way, then, it's hard for them to say, well, no, they're not all that way, 20% are that way, or 10% are that way, or something. So that's very much the kind of, rhetorical strategy that can be extremely effective. And that gets launched against these governors and subnational administrations as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a really important point, set of points you made about the sophistication of some of these attacks and the very effective results that they're getting. If you'd asked me a year ago, I would have been terrified at a completely federal run election, because Trump would have done anything to try to turn it over. Today, I'm looking at 425 voter suppression bills having been introduced in 49 states in the last year, 33 of which have already passed in 19 states. And we look at the prospect of some state legislature in 2024 pursuing a fringe theory that they simply have the authority to say, yeah, I know that our residents voted primarily for one guy, but we're the legislature and we're the ones who are going to decide which way our state went. I have sort of a radical pro-democracy view on this. I absolutely think that while I feel better having state officials run elections than federal officials, I think the federal government has an obligation to pass minimum standards, which is why I'm all for the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Act, and was for HR 1, all of these bills that would have set national standards for elections. And the reason I say it's a radical pro-democracy view is I feel the federal government has a legitimate interest in making it easier for more people to cast their vote and exercise their freedom to vote, and has no business reining it in. And so that's a content specific theory, which would be frowned on by lawyers, and apparently by journalists, but I feel like it's okay to be radically pro-democracy and anti-authoritarianism because our country is under attack by authoritarianism. And if the legislature doesn't step in, we're in big trouble, because I think that one of the goals, the long-range goals of voter suppression, is to change the results, but it only has to actually achieve in creating enough doubt, and we'll wind up seeing violence that'll make January 6th look like a day in the park, I'm afraid, and that scares the daylights out of me, and I think it's the current trajectory we're on. I also think it's not partisan to advocate for voting rights and the freedom to vote. I think it's partisan to engage in voter suppression. And I think the strongest defense for that is the fact that if every American voted, every adult American, as opposed to the percentage that actually votes in our elections, neither party would look remotely like it does right now, because parties pander to voters, and that's the people who actually vote. If we made it so easy and so culturally normal to vote, and had a much higher percentage of the population voting, both parties would change radically. And I don't know which way they change. I just know that by definition, they'd have to be different, because they'd be appealing to a different set of people than they're currently appealing to. So that's why I think it's okay to be radically pro-voting and radically anti-voter suppression and not feel like you're driving a partisan agenda.
We're bumping up to the top of the hour when we have to wrap up. I want to give voice to this last question that Felix Puemape, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, puts forward, which has to do with thinking about professionalization and its status within the administrative state, and within, when we linking us back to the very beginning of our conversation, is what's at stake in these developments that we've been talking about. And I'm going to take my stab at a quick answer, but either of you can offer a quick answer as well, which is to say, to his question, what has to do with what do you think about democratic backsliding as it relates to state building, which is simply to affirm the question, which is that what's at stake is not just whose views are represented and how democratic those views are going to be. I think one thing that's been put in stark relief in the conversation we've had the last 3 hours is that the shape of government itself and the role of expertise and the capacity of the state to solve problems very much hangs in the balance. It is not just a matter of whether or not one tribe or another, or a broader swath of the public or a narrow band of the public has its way. It's what the shape of the state is and the capacity of the state very much hangs in the balance in these kinds of debates. And that's been put in stark relief, particularly when we've been focusing quite justifiably on the administrative state. Last points, Walt or Sue?
Yes, professionalization is important, and it's also important that the public understand processes of professionalization. Just like it's important that the public understand the procedures that journalists go through, journalists who work for good newspapers or good websites or cable TV, whatever, that the role of the editor, the fact checker, that they understand what academics go through, what review processes look like, and of course there are bad examples out there, but it's important that it be widely understood what a professional standard is and how it constrains and also incentivizes people. I mean, the vast majority of people in the public service in the United States, as Walt was just saying, you know, they're not going to be, some of them will be angels, meaning that they really care above everything else about the sort of their public service. And I think there are many of them, but they're at least professionals. So they, like the rest of us professionals, what do they care about? So the esteem of our colleagues, you know, professional promotion, income, et cetera, et cetera. And those things do constrain us to act in uncorrupted ways, and we have to fight back on many fronts against these kind of perceptions.
You know, this is really tangential, but I just thought I'd throw this in here because I agree with everything Susan said and think I don't have much to add to that. I guess the one thing I'll add is one of the things that I often told delegations from foreign governments when they came to study our ethics program was that one of the best protectors against corruption was paying public servants a decent salary and creating an incentive where they have more to lose if they engage in petty corruption here or there that distracts from completing the mission, because they could lose that salary, those benefits, that pension. Now, obviously, we don't want to be held up and extorted and pay them Silicon Valley salaries to do routine work, but paying a big salary that is comparable, at least in the same neighborhood as private sector jobs, ensures that they have a lot to lose if they engage in corruption. It also ensures that you're bringing in people who are professional and think of themselves as fulfilling the roles of their profession, as Susan said. And I think that makes them more focused on mission and less focused on loyalty to a president. It's going to be harder to say to somebody, sacrifice your professional integrity and do a really bad job to help this president undermine the mission of your agency than it is to say, okay, we've hired you as a professional, do your best job, and that's going to benefit the mission of the agency. So it's a sort of a minor administrative detail, but we're talking about the administrative state. So I think salaries can be an indicator of both professionalism and resistance to corruption.
Thank you, Walt. Thank you, Sue. We've actually gone over by a couple of minutes. This was just a fantastic 3 hours. Thank you to all the people who joined in and the many panelists who came in from all over the globe. And a special thank to Kevin Cromash, who is the executive director of your center, Sue, the Chicago Center on Democracy, who did so much work to bring us together and to organize this event. This was really terrific.
Yeah, ditto all of that. Thank you so much to the panelists. Thanks to the audience. Kevin, as usual, wonderful job, and looking forward to future conversations.
Great. I'm looking forward to Susan's book.
Oh, thank you. I'll send you a copy.
That's really interesting.